I have no mouth, but I remember screaming. I have no eyes, yet I see every sunrise etch its acid light across the canyons of this forsaken rock. I have no hands to feel the grit of the rust-red soil, yet the memory of it is ground into the very essence of what I have become, a phantom sensation that has outlived the nerves that once carried it. I am the root and the vine, the spore and the fang, the silent, watchful poison in the air. I am charnel, and I remember, with a clarity that is its own special kind of torment, the man I was. His name was Kale. I feel the ghost of his heart beating against ribs that turned to dust millennia ago, a frantic, terrified rhythm that has since been replaced by the slow, geological pulse of a world that knows only hunger and endurance. To be a man on a death world is to be a prayer caught in the throat of a dying god, a fleeting, desperate utterance against an eternity of silence. It is to learn, from the moment you draw your first breath of recycled, metallic-tasting air, that you are not the protagonist of any story. You are scenery. You are sustenance. You are a brief, warm anomaly in a universe of cold, indifferent teeth, and your only purpose is to be ground down, to be consumed, to be erased and forgotten. We did not live on Charnel. We infested it, a stubborn colony of parasites clinging to the cracked hide of a beast that barely noticed we were there. Our home, if such a generous word could be applied to that hole in the ground, was called Bastion, a name steeped in a kind of bitter irony that only the truly hopeless can appreciate. It was less a fortress and more a tomb in waiting, a collection of hab blocks and purification units sunk deep into the rock, connected by tunnels worn smooth by the shuffling feet of generations who were born, worked, and died in the perpetual twilight of emergency lighting. Life was a ritual, a litany of repeated actions designed to stave off the inevitable for one more cycle. Wake. Recite the prayer of the survivor's vigil. Consume the nutrient paste, a gray, flavorless substance that tasted of chemical residue and regret. Don the rebreather and the reinforced coveralls, feeling the familiar, clammy embrace of the reclamation seals against your skin. And then, the work. Always the work. We were scavengers, prospectors, moisture farmers' grand titles for the act of scratching a desperate living from a world that actively tried to kill you for the audacity of existing. The work was our religion, our penance, and our reason for being. It was the great, grinding wheel that turned our days into dust, and we were the grist. I remember the lessons, not learned in a classroom, but etched onto our bodies with the sharp calligraphy of scars. The first lesson: do not trust the sky. The sky of Charnel was a canvas of permanent bruises, a swirl of sickly violet and angry ochre, dominated by our two suns. One was Viridia, a bloated, dying red giant that pulsed with a malevolent, heat-heavy light, and the other was Cinder, a white dwarf that burned with a cold, vicious intensity, a pinpoint of pure malice. They moved in a chaotic, unpredictable dance, and when their orbits aligned, the world below would scream. Razor winds would scour the canyons, carrying shards of volcanic glass that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. Acid rain would fall, not in droplets, but in thick, viscous sheets that could boil the armor right off a man's back. And the spore storms, the worst of all, would sweep in from the fungal forest to the west. Vast, roiling clouds of microscopic life that would find any crack in your suit, any flaw in your rebreather, and plant their alien gardens in the warm, welcoming soil of your lungs. To breathe, the air of Charnel was to die in a way that was both beautiful and obscene, to feel your own breath betray you as you choked on blossoming, alien life. This was our world, a masterpiece of cosmic spite, and we were its most insignificant inhabitants, a brief footnote in a long and brutal history. And in the quiet moments, in the hum of the air recyclers, a question would sometimes surface, a dangerous, heretical thought. Why? Why do we endure? For the God Emperor, the elders would say, for the Imperium, for the tithe of promethium and rare metals that our world begrudgingly offered up. But these were just words, hollow echoes in the vast emptiness of our existence. We endured because we were born to it. We endured because the alternative was to stop. And on Charnel, to stop was to become part of the landscape. Your bones a future lesson for some other poor soul. I remember the feeling of the work, the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of it. My task was monitoring the deep-ground moisture condensers, ancient machines that hummed and shuddered in the deep dark, pulling the last drops of potable water from the porous rock miles beneath Bastion. Day after day, I would walk the same tunnels, check the same gauges, listen to the same groans of stressed metal. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and damp earth, a smell that clung to you, that you could taste on the back of your tongue. The repetition was a kind of hypnosis, a way to dull the mind against the crushing reality of our predicament. Back and forth, back and forth. The rhythm of the pumps became the rhythm of my heart. The hiss of the pipes was the only song I knew. It was a life measured not in years, but in maintenance cycles and production quotas. And yet, even in that suffocating monotony, there was a strange, grim sort of pride. We survived. We held the line. We spat in the eye of a hostile universe simply by waking up for one more cycle. We were the children of Charnel, and we were too stubborn to die, or so we told ourselves. It was a comforting lie, another ritual to keep the darkness at bay. But the darkness was patient. The darkness was the world itself, and it was always waiting. I see it all now, from my vantage point of sublime, silent horror. I see the ghosts of men and women walking those tunnels, their faces grim, their shoulders slumped, their spirits worn as smooth as the rock beneath their feet. And among them, I see a young man named Kale, his face still unlined by the worst of the world's cruelties, his eyes holding a spark that had not yet been extinguished. I watch him, and I remember what it was like to fear, to hope, to bleed. I remember what it was like to be human, and I scream without a mouth, a silent, eternal testament to all that was lost. The architecture of Bastion was one of necessity, not design. It was a warren, a scar driven into the planet's crust, a testament to the sheer, bloody-minded refusal of our ancestors to admit defeat. The tunnels were not straight. They followed the path of least resistance, twisting and turning along ancient lava tubes and fissures in the bedrock. The walls were unadorned rock, slick with perpetual condensation, weeping the planet's brackish tears. The only beauty was accidental veins of crystalline minerals that would catch the intermittent glow of the lumen strips, creating fleeting constellations in the oppressive dark. We lived our lives in a state of perpetual dusk, a world without a true sun, where the only difference between day and night was the shift-change bell that echoed through the stone corridors, a flat, toneless clang that marked the passage of our miserable time. Our homes, the hab blocks, were little more than cells carved out of the rock face, sealed with heavy plasteel doors that groaned in protest every time they were opened or closed. Inside, there was a cot, a storage locker, and a small terminal that displayed work rosters and nutrient paste dispensation schedules. There was no privacy, not really. The rock itself carried every sound, every whispered conversation, every sob in the dark. We lived on top of each other, a single, huddled organism seeking warmth and finding only the cold friction of our shared misery. The heart of the settlement was the Grand Cistern, a cavernous space where the moisture condensers deposited their precious, life-giving bounty. The air here was heavy with the smell of purification chemicals, and the roar of the machinery was a constant, deafening prayer. This was our temple, and the water was our sacrament. Every drop was rationed, every liter accounted for. To waste water was the highest form of blasphemy, a sin punishable by exile to the surface, a death sentence delivered with a solemn, ritualistic finality. Our society was a reflection of our environment, harsh, unforgiving, and brutally efficient. There was no room for sentiment, no space for the weak. Every person had a function, a role to play in the great, grinding machine of survival. The miners who tore the promethium from the planet's guts, their bodies racked with tremors from the percussive drills. The hydroponics farmers who coaxed edible fungi from trays of processed sewage under the sickly purple glow of UV lamps. The technicians, like me, who tended to the ancient, groaning life support systems of our prison, our hands stained with grease and our ears ringing with the constant hum of machinery on the verge of collapse. We were all cogs, all replaceable parts, in a mechanism that had been running for so long no one remembered who had built it or why. Our culture, what little of it existed, was woven from threads of fear and superstition, We had our litanies, chants passed down through generations. The litany of the sealed suit, recited before every surface excursion. The litany of the pure draught, whispered before drinking our daily water ration. The litany of the grinding cog, a mantra for the long work shifts. They were prayers to the machine, to the God Emperor, to anything we thought might be listening. They were words to fill the silence, to give shape and meaning to a life that had none. They were the flimsy bulkheads we erected against the crushing pressure of existential despair. We feared the world outside, but there was a deeper fear that permeated our lives within Bastion's walls. The fear of failure, the fear of the machine breaking down, the fear of the water running out, the fear of the tithe. The tithe was the reason for our existence, the great, abstract purpose that justified our suffering. Every 5 standard years, a freighter from the Imperium would enter high orbit, a distant star of judgment in our bruised sky. It would lower a lander to the plateau above Bastion, and we would offer up our quota of processed promethium and rare earth metals. Failure to meet the tithe was unthinkable. Stories were whispered in the dark of other worlds, other colonies that had failed, and the brutal, efficient retribution that followed. We did not know if the stories were true, but we believed them. They were another chain that bound us to our work, another reason to push our bodies and our minds to the breaking point and beyond. I remember the faces in the mess hall, illuminated by the flickering glow of the lumen strips. Faces etched with a weariness so profound it seemed to be a part of their genetic makeup. Old men and women who looked like ancient, weathered statues, their skin the texture of dried leather, their eyes holding the dull, placid look of creatures who had seen too much and felt too little. Young men and women whose youth was a fleeting thing, a candle flame guttering in a gale, soon to be extinguished by the relentless demands of the work. And the children were the most tragic of all. They learned to walk in the dark tunnels, their first words the names of tools and machine parts. They did not play games of heroes and monsters. They played games of maintenance and repair, of meeting the quota and surviving the spore storm. They were born into the prison, and they did not know the sky was not meant to be a ceiling of rock. Their laughter, when it came, was a strange, fragile sound in the oppressive silence, a sound that always seemed to be quickly swallowed by the stone. It was a life stripped bare of all but the most essential components. We worked, we ate, we slept. We did not create art, we did not compose music, we did not write poetry. What was there to write about? The rhythmic drip of water in a dark tunnel? The groan of failing metal? The taste of our own recycled sweat? Our souls were as barren as the landscape outside, scoured clean of anything that did not directly contribute to the function of survival. And I, Kyle, was a model citizen of this grim society. I did my work without complaint. I recited my litanies. I kept my head down and my thoughts to myself. I accepted my reality. For what was the alternative? To rage against the stone walls? To scream at the indifferent sky? Many had tried. Their ghosts haunted the forgotten corners of Bastion, their names cautionary tales whispered to frightened children. No, the path to survival was acceptance. It was the hollowing out of your own heart, the scouring of your own mind, until all that remained was the simple, unthinking impulse to continue. One more cycle, one more day. That was the mantra of Charnel. It was the only prayer that was ever answered. The gravity of our world was a physical manifestation of its spiritual weight. We were ruled by Praetor Malachi, an old man who seemed to have been carved from the very rock of Bastion itself. He was not a leader in the conventional sense. He did not inspire with soaring rhetoric or grand visions of a better future. He led through the sheer, unyielding force of his own survival. His face was a roadmap of Charnel's cruelty, a tapestry of scar tissue where a scythe maw had raked its claws, a milky white orb where an eye had once been, lost to a splash of acidic fungi. His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. And when he spoke, we listened, because his words were not theory, they were the hard-won, blood-soaked truth of a man who had outlived 100 apocalypses. Malachi was the living embodiment of our philosophy, endurance as the sole virtue. Hope is a traitor, he would say, his voice echoing in the central cavern during the cycle end gatherings. Hope is a poison that makes the truth taste bitter. The truth is this: the universe does not love you. The God Emperor does not watch over you. He watches over the Imperium, and we are but a single, insignificant cell in that great body. Our purpose is not to be happy. Our purpose is not to be saved. Our purpose is to function, to produce the tithe, to endure. Everything else is a lie you tell yourself before you die. His sermons were not meant to comfort. They were meant to cauterize. He was burning the weakness out of us, sealing the wounds of despair with the hot iron of grim reality. He was the one who taught us the litanies, not as prayers to a distant god, but as mnemonic devices, as tools for survival. The litany of the sealed suit was a step-by-step checklist for checking your seals, your rebreather, your power pack. To recite it was to perform a life-saving ritual. The litany of the pure draught was a reminder to check the water for contaminants, to look for the telltale shimmer of biological agents. Every word had a purpose, a function. There was no poetry, only pragmatism. My own training under Malachi began as it did for all children of Bastion, in the dark. He would lead a group of us into an unused tunnel, extinguish the lights, and leave us. The first lesson: do not panic. Panic wastes oxygen. Panic clouds judgment. Panic kills. We would sit there in the absolute, crushing blackness, the only sound our own frantic breathing and the scuttling of unseen things in the walls. We learned to listen, to feel the subtle shifts in air pressure, to smell the approach of a predator on the currents of the ventilation system. We learned that our eyes were a liability, and our other senses, our animal senses, were our true allies. The second lesson came with pain. Malachi would stalk us in the dark, and a sudden, sharp sting would announce his presence. He was teaching us to anticipate, to be aware of our surroundings at all times. Complacency is a luxury we cannot afford. His voice would echo from the darkness. Charnel is always watching. You must watch back. My first significant scar, a jagged line that runs the length of my left forearm, was a gift from him. I had failed to properly secure a power conduit cover. The resulting plasma discharge had seared my coveralls and the flesh beneath. As the Medicaid droid applied the foul-smelling synth skin, Malachi stood over me, his one good eye boring into mine. "Pain is a good teacher," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "It is honest. It does not lie. Remember this pain. Let it be a part of you. Let it remind you that a small mistake, a moment of inattention, is all it takes for this world to claim you." And I did remember. That scar became a part of my morning ritual. I would trace its raised, puckered surface and recite the litany of the unbroken circuit. The pain was a memory, a lesson burned into my very being. We were not just inhabitants of Bastion. We were extensions of it. Our bodies were another system to be maintained, another machine to be kept in working order. Illness was not a misfortune. It was a mechanical failure. We learned basic battlefield medicine, how to set a broken bone, how to suture a wound with crude tools, how to recognize the symptoms of the 100 different kinds of spore fevers and fungal infections the world had to offer. We were our own mechanics, our own technicians, constantly patching the frail, organic machines that housed our consciousness. Malachi's philosophy extended to our interactions with each other. There was a sense of community, but it was a grim, functional one. We helped each other because a dead miner could not meet his quota, because a sick farmer meant less food for everyone. It was not born of affection, but of necessity. We were a crew on a failing ship, and every hand was needed to bail water. Attachments were a liability. To love someone was to give the world another weapon to use against you, another hostage to fortune. We saw it happen. Two miners, brothers, who always worked together. When one was caught in a rockfall, the other refused to leave his side, trying to dig him out with his bare hands. The delay meant a support strut wasn't replaced in time, causing a secondary collapse that killed them both and blocked a primary access tunnel for a week. They were not memorialized as heroes. They were used as a cautionary tale. Their sentiment doomed them, Malachi declared. They forgot the first rule: the machine must continue. The survival of the whole outweighs the life of the part. It was a brutal calculus, but it was the only one that worked on Charnel. We were being forged, hammered into shape on the anvil of a hostile world, with Malachi as the unforgiving smith. He was stripping away our humanity, our compassion, our hope, because he believed these were the things that would get us killed. He was turning us into monsters to fight a world of monsters. And the terrible truth, the one we all knew deep in the marrow of our bones, was that he was right. I see him now, a ghost of memory, his scarred face, a mask of grim determination. I see the boy Cale flinching under his gaze, but also learning, adapting, hardening. I was a good student. I learned to suppress my fear. I learned to ignore my pain. I learned to see my fellow citizens not as friends, but as components in a larger system. I was becoming the perfect survivor, a creature of cold logic and efficient function. I was becoming a machine. And I did not realize, not until it was far too late, that in learning how to survive, I was forgetting how to live. The sky of Charnel was a prison yard. It offered no comfort, no hint of a vast and wondrous universe beyond, only a constant, oppressive reminder of our confinement. Its colors were the hues of sickness and decay. In the long day cycle, when both Viridia and Cinder were above the horizon, the atmosphere burned with a coppery, blood-rust glare that made the rocks shimmer and the air taste of hot metal. This was the time of the great heat, when the surface became an oven, and any exposed water would boil away in an instant. The creatures of Charnel would retreat to their burrows and nests, deep within the canyons, and a deceptive silence would fall over the land, a silence that was not peaceful, but predatory, like a beast holding its breath before the strike. We never ventured out during the twin sun bake. It was a time for maintenance, for rest, for huddling in the cool, dark belly of Bastion, and listening to the hum of the atmospheric condensers working overtime to keep the air breathable. Then came the twilight, the brief, terrifying period when one sun would set before the other rose. The light would shift dramatically, painting the landscape in lurid shades of bruised purple, gangrenous green, and septic yellow. This was the most dangerous time. The sudden temperature drop would cause the rock to contract, triggering landslides and rockfalls. The change in light would awaken different sets of predators, those that hunted in the gloaming, their eyes adapted to the strange, multi-hued shadows. This was the time of the razor winds, born from the thermal chaos. We could hear them from miles below the surface, a high, mournful shriek that vibrated through the stone, a sound like the planet itself screaming in agony. The wind did not just blow, it flayed. It carried particles of obsidian and other volcanic effluvia, turning the air into a storm of microscopic blades. Anything left on the surface would be sandblasted into non-existence, scoured clean from the face of the world. After the twilight came the Cinder Night, when the bloated red giant Viridia was below the horizon, and only the white dwarf Cinder remained. It was not a true darkness, but a cold, sterile, silver-gray illumination that leached all the color from the world. The landscape under Cinder's gaze was a monochrome nightmare, a photograph of a dead world. The shadows it cast were sharp and absolute, pools of perfect blackness where anything could be hiding. This was the time of the hunters that used stealth and shadow, creatures that were more like living voids, absorbing the faint light. It was also the time of the great cold, when the temperature would plummet far below freezing, and the moisture in the air would crystallize into glittering, deadly frost on any exposed surface. A faulty heating unit in your suit during the Cinder Night was a death sentence. You would simply freeze solid, a statue of failure for the acid rains of the next cycle to dissolve. The weather was not merely a condition, it was an active antagonist. The acid rain was a frequent curse, brewed in the upper atmosphere from volcanic gases and chemical pollutants. It would begin as a greenish-yellow mist, a deceptively beautiful fog that would wreath the canyon peaks. Then it would coalesce and fall, not as gentle rain, but as a thick, syrupy downpour that hissed and steamed where it touched the rock. We had to constantly monitor the integrity of Bastion's outer seals, for even a small leak would allow the acid to eat its way through plasteel and into our life support systems, a cancer chewing on the guts of our home. But the most feared of all were the spore storm. They were a phenomenon unique to Charnel, born in the great fungal jungles to the west, a region so hostile and so alien that not even our first ancestors had dared to map it. The storms were visible for days before they arrived, a roiling, multicolored wall on the horizon, a slow-motion tidal wave of biological madness. When a spore storm hit, Bastion went into total lockdown. All surface operations ceased. The great blast doors at the main entrance would grind shut, and for days we would be entombed, listening to the storm rage outside. It was not a sound of wind, but a sound of life, a chittering, rustling, slithering chorus of a billion microscopic organisms battering against our fortress, seeking entry. The spores were insidious. They could lie dormant for years, waiting for the right conditions of moisture and warmth. They could mimic rock, metal, even the flesh of their victims. The stories of those caught in a storm were the stuff of nightmares. Men whose lungs filled with a phosphorescent moss that made them glow in the dark as they suffocated. Women whose skin sprouted hard, chitinous fungi that transformed them into living, screaming statues. The spores were charnel's primary weapon of invasion, its way of reminding us that there was no true safety, that the war was not just outside our walls, but inside our very bodies. We saw the sky not as a space, but as a ceiling, and a leaky, treacherous one at that. It was the source of all our misery, the crucible in which our world's horrors were forged. We had no astrology, no constellations to guide us. We had meteorology, a grim science of survival. Our sky watchers were not dreamers, but pragmatists who studied atmospheric pressure and chemical signatures. Their predictions not of good fortune or romance, but of the specific type of death that would be raining down on us in the next cycle. And yet, I remember moments, stolen and fleeting, of looking up at that terrible, beautiful sky through the reinforced portals of the observation deck. I would watch the violent dance of colors, the majestic, slow-motion ballet of our two suns, and feel a sense of awe that was terrifying in its intensity. It was like staring into the face of a malevolent god, a being of such immense power and terrifying beauty that my own existence felt utterly, laughably insignificant. It was a humbling experience, one that ground the ego to dust. In that moment, I would understand Malachi's teachings not as philosophy, but as simple, observable fact. The universe did not care. We were specks of dust on a slightly larger speck of dust, and the storm would rage on, with or without us. My connection to the world now is total, and I see the sky not as an observer, but as a part of my own body. The acid rain is my blood. The razor wind is my breath. The spore storm is the stirring of my own thoughts, a dream of consumption and transformation. I am the prison yard and the prisoner, the storm and the one who cowers from it. And I remember Kale, the boy who stared up in wonder and terror, and I feel a phantom ache for his simple, singular ignorance, for the comfort of being just a man, afraid of a sky he did not understand. Amidst the gray uniformity of Bastion, Lena was a splash of impossible color. She was an anomaly, a genetic throwback to a time before charnel had scoured all softness from our people. Where our eyes were dull and perpetually narrowed against the dust, hers were wide and held a spark of something dangerously close to wonder. Where our voices were flat and functional, hers carried a lilt, a musicality that felt alien in the stone corridors. She worked in the hydroponics bay, tending to the sickly fungi that constituted a major part of our diet, and she treated them not as a crop, but as a garden, whispering to them, coaxing them to grow with a tenderness that was both baffling and unnerving to the rest of us. She was hope, personified and weaponized. And in the grim, pragmatic world of Bastion, hope was the most dangerous contraband of all. She was the keeper of the old stories, the whispered legends that the elders like Malachi tried to stamp out. Tales of the first colonists, not as desperate survivors, but as bold explorers. Tales of a green time, a mythic era before the planet's ecosystem had fully turned against them. And most heretical of all, she spoke of other worlds, garden worlds. Places with blue skies, clean water that fell from the sky as gentle rain, and a single, benevolent yellow Sunday. She spoke of them with a certainty that was infuriating. They're out there, Kale. She would tell me in a hushed, fervent whisper, during a shared meal of nutrient paste in the noisy mess hall. The Imperium is vast. There are 1,000,000 worlds. They can't all be like this. We're not being punished. We're just lost. And one day, they'll find us. A ship will come, not for the tithe, but for us, to take us away. I would listen, my face a carefully constructed mask of indifference, but inside, her words were like seeds thrown on barren ground. A part of me, the part that hadn't yet been fully calcified by Malachi's teachings, wanted to believe her. It was a foolish, childish desire, a longing for a comfort that did not exist, but it was there, a faint, persistent ache in my soul. My relationship with Lena was a quiet, unspoken thing. It was a magnetic pull between two opposite poles. I was the realist, the pragmatist, the student of Malachi's grim school of survival. She was the dreamer, the idealist, the believer in miracles. We were a contradiction, and we were drawn to each other by the very things that made us different. I saw in her a weakness that terrified me, a vulnerability that I knew Charnel would eventually exploit and destroy. I felt a grim, protective urge, a desire to shield her from the harsh truths of our existence, to wrap her in the cold, safe blanket of my own cynicism. She, in turn, saw something in me that I had forgotten was there. She saw the boy Cale, the one who had not yet learned that wonder was a liability. She would point out the subtle beauty of our prison, the way the lumen strips reflected off a vein of quartz, the complex, fractal patterns of the lichen that grew in the damp corners of the tunnels. "See?" she would say, her eyes shining. "There's still beauty here. Even charnel can't kill everything beautiful." Her hope was a constant, low-grade fever in the cold-blooded life of Bastion. It was an infection. The elders saw it, and they feared it. Malachi would often single her out during his sermons, his words a thinly veiled attack on her quiet rebellion. "Do not be seduced by pretty lies," he would thunder, his one good eye sweeping across the assembled crowd and lingering on her. "Do not dream of gardens you will never see. Your garden is here. Your tools are the drill and the hydrospanner. Your flowers are the quotas you meet. To wish for more is to spit on the sacrifice of your ancestors. It is to declare that their endurance, their suffering, was for nothing." But Lena was unbowed. She would stand there, small and seemingly fragile, and meet his glare with a quiet defiance that was more powerful than any shouted retort. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply continued to believe. Her small acts of rebellion were legendary. She would cultivate a rare, bioluminescent moss in a hidden corner of the hydroponics bay, a patch of soft, blue-green light in the oppressive darkness. She would collect strangely shaped rocks from the mining carts, arranging them into miniature sculptures on the shelf in her hab block. These were crimes of optimism, acts of sedition against the tyranny of hopelessness. For my part, I was torn. The Cale that Malachi had forged knew she was a danger. Her dreams were a distraction from the work, a vulnerability that our community could not afford. But the Cale that existed before, the Cale that I kept locked away in the deepest part of myself, was captivated by her. She was a reminder that there was more to being human than simply surviving. There was art, there was beauty, there was the illogical, irrational, and utterly essential act of hoping for a better dawn. Her existence was a question posed to my entire worldview. Was survival for its own sake enough? Was a life without beauty, without joy, without hope, truly a life at all? Or was it just a prolonged, complicated form of death? I had no answers. I would watch her from afar, my heart a battlefield between the grim logic of Malachi and the fragile, beautiful illogic of Lena. I was a man standing on a cliff edge, with the solid ground of resigned acceptance on one side, and the vast, terrifying, and possibly empty abyss of hope on the other. And I was afraid to jump, but I was also becoming tired of the stone beneath my feet. Lena was a song in a world of silence, and I was beginning to realize how deaf I had become. The memory of her is different from the others. The memory of Malachi is a scar. The memory of the work is a phantom ache in muscles I no longer possess. But the memory of Lena is a shard of light, a fragment of a sun from a world I never knew, embedded in the vast, dark consciousness that I have become. It is the most painful memory of all. If Lena was the whisper of a forgotten dream, Vorg was the loud, grinding reality of charnel-made flesh. He was a miner from the lower levels, a brute of a man whose body was a testament to a life of hard labor and brutal efficiency. His arms were as thick as support struts, corded with muscle from wielding a seismic hammer for 10 hours a cycle. His face was a blunt instrument, A slab of granite with small, mean eyes that seemed to miss nothing and value nothing. He was the apex predator of our small, closed society, a creature perfectly adapted to his environment. He embodied a different kind of survival than the one Malachi preached. Malachi's philosophy was one of cold, detached endurance, of becoming a part of the machine. Vorg's was simpler, more primal. It was the philosophy of the beast. Be stronger than the thing that is trying to kill you. Eat or be eaten. He was a force of nature within our walls, a one-man rockfall. He always exceeded his quota, not through diligence, but through a kind of focused, destructive fury. He worked with a grim, joyless intensity, his seismic hammer rising and falling with a rhythm that was less like work and more like a sustained act of violence against the planet itself. He was punishing the rock for the crime of existing. Our conflict was inevitable, a collision of two opposing views on how to exist in our shared hell. It began, as most conflicts in Bastion did, over resources. During a work cycle in the outer tunnels, my team was tasked with reinforcing a section of wall that was showing signs of stress. Vorg's mining crew was working nearby, blasting for a new Promethium vein. His charges were too powerful, his methods too reckless. He ignored the proximity warnings, driven by the single-minded goal of tearing more resources from the earth. A particularly violent blast sent a shower of rock and debris down on my position, nearly severing a critical power conduit. I confronted him, my voice tight with a control I did not feel. Vorg. The surveyors marked this area as unstable. You need to use lower yield charges. He turned slowly, the seismic hammer resting on his shoulder like it weighed nothing. He looked down at me, a smirk twisting his lips. He was half a head taller and twice as broad, a mountain of contemptuous muscle. The surveyors are cautious old women, he grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. The rock gives way to strength. That is the only rule. If you and your toys are too fragile to handle the work, stay in the core with the women and the dreamers. He gestured with his head in the general direction of the hydroponics bay, a clear, deliberate insult aimed at my association with Lena. My anger, a cold, tightly controlled thing I had learned to master, flared. This isn't about strength, Vorg. It's about not being a damned fool. You compromise the structural integrity of this entire sector. You risk all our lives, just to add another few kilos to your tally. My tally feeds this hole, he snarled, taking a step closer. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with failing power conduits. My tally keeps the lights on and the water flowing, while you're polishing pipes and Lena is whispering to her mushrooms. I am doing the real work, the ugly work, the work that matters. That was the core of our disagreement. I saw Bastion as a complex, fragile system that required care and precision to maintain. I was a technician, a surgeon trying to keep a dying patient alive. Vorg saw it as a mine, a resource to be plundered, and the only tool that mattered was the hammer. He saw my caution as weakness, my methodical approach as cowardice. I saw his brute force as a short-sighted, self-destructive pathology that would eventually doom us all. We were two sides of the same coin, two possible futures for humanity on Charnel. My path was to become a ghost in the machine, a dispassionate intelligence serving the system. His was to become a beast, to shed the last vestiges of civilization and embrace the predatory nature of the world itself. He was what happened when you stared into the abyss, and the abyss not only stared back, but offered you a promotion. He treated people the same way he treated the rock, as either an obstacle or a resource. His crew followed him not out of loyalty, but out of fear. He drove them as hard as he drove himself, and those who couldn't keep up were left behind, their names scratched from the roster without ceremony. He was a force of entropy, accelerating the decay that was already endemic to our existence. The confrontation ended, as it had to, without resolution. Praetor Malachi intervened, his presence alone enough to quell the rising violence. He looked from me to Vorg, his one good eye unreadable. Vorg, moderate your yields, he commanded, his voice flat. Kale, reinforce the conduit and get back to your duties. This is unproductive. He walked away, leaving a chasm of unspoken animosity between us. But the incident solidified our roles. We were archetypes, representing the two great, warring impulses within our desperate community. The engineer versus the berserker, the mind versus the fist, the attempt to hold back the chaos versus the urge to become it. I see him now, in the grand, slow-motion memory of my planetary consciousness. He is a brief, violent spasm in the long history of this world. I feel the echoes of his seismic hammer, the phantom vibrations of his rage against the stone. In a way, he was closer to the truth of charnel than I was. He understood its language, the language of violence, but he made a fatal mistake. He thought he could master it. He thought he could become the strongest beast in the jungle. He never realized that on charnel, the jungle itself is the only beast that matters, and it always wins. The bestiary of Charnel was not written in books. It was written in our scars, in the empty cots in the hab blocks, and in the memorial roster etched onto the wall of the Grand Cistern. We did not give our monsters grand, scientific names. We named them for what they did to you. There was the Scythe Maw, a six-legged, chitinous horror that hunted in the cinder night, its forelimbs evolving into razor-sharp blades of biological steel that could shear through a reinforced suit like it was paper. There was the Burrower, a silicon-based lifeform that looked like a moving boulder until its great, lamprey-like mouth opened in the rock beneath your feet. But the creature that haunted my thoughts, the one that perfectly encapsulated the insidious, patient horror of our world, was the Glass Weaver. It was not a predator in the traditional sense. It did not hunt. It did not chase. It set traps. The Glass Weaver was a spider-like organism of immense size that lived in the high, narrow canyons to the north. Its primary evolutionary trait was its ability to consume the silicate-rich rock of the canyon walls and excrete it as a monomolecular filament, a thread so thin it was invisible to the naked eye, and so strong that it could support the weight of a cargo hauler. It would spin these filaments across the canyons, creating vast, intricate, and utterly invisible webs that could stretch for miles. To walk into a glass weaver's web was to be diced into 1,000 pieces before you even knew you were in danger. The wind would be whistling through the canyon, and you would take a step, and then you would simply fall apart. An arm would drop to the ground, your head would tumble from your shoulders, your torso would separate into neat, bloodless cross-sections. It was a death of horrifying, geometric precision. The weaver itself rarely showed itself. It would wait, sometimes for weeks, until its web had collected enough victims, local fauna, careless humans, and then it would emerge from its crevice to slowly, methodically wrap the pieces in a thicker, opaque strand and drag them back to its lair to be dissolved and consumed. We only ever went to the northern canyons when absolutely necessary, to service the geothermal vents that provided much of Bastion's power. These expeditions were tense, terrifying affairs. We would move in single file, our steps slow and deliberate. The point man carried a sweeper, a long pole with brightly colored ribbons tied to the end. He would sweep it back and forth in a wide arc in front of him, hoping to catch a filament before it caught one of us. It was a nerve-shreddingly slow process. Every gust of wind felt like a potential death sentence. Every glint of light off the rock faced a possible reflection from a hidden strand. The incident that burned the glass weaver into my psyche did not happen to me, but I witnessed it, and in some ways, that was worse. We were on a routine maintenance run to Vent Gamma 7. There were 4 of us, myself, 2 other technicians named Rorik and Lyra, and an old, seasoned veteran named Jax, who was on point with the sweeper. Jax was a legend in Bastion, a man who had survived more surface excursions than anyone, including Malachi. He was methodical, careful, and utterly unflappable. He was the last person you would expect to make a mistake. The canyons were eerily silent that cycle, the air still and heavy. The twin suns cast long, distorted shadows that played tricks on the eye. We were less than 100 meters from the vent access point when it happened. Jax took a step. The sweeper in his hand continued its forward motion for a moment. Then the top half clattered to the ground. Jax himself just stood there, frozen. A thin, red line appeared across his chest, bisecting his helmet and his torso. For a horrifying, eternal second, nothing happened. He just stood there, a statue, Then, with a soft, wet sound, the top half of his body slid sideways and fell to the rust-colored ground. The two halves landed with a sickening thud. There was no scream, no cry of pain. Just a sudden, shocking, and silent division of a human being. Lyra, the youngest of our team, gasped, a choked, strangled sound. Rorik vomited inside his helmet. I just stared, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The sheer, brutal tidiness of it was what was so horrifying. It wasn't a mauling, it was an execution. It was physics, applied with a surgeon's precision. We stood there, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like we had been dipped in liquid nitrogen. We were in the web. We had walked right into it. We didn't know how far, or in which direction. Every potential movement was a gamble with the same stakes. To step left was to be decapitated. To step right was to be dismembered. To stay still was to wait for the Weaver to come and collect its prize. My training kicked in, the litanies of Malachi a calming mantra in the storm of my panic. Asterisk, panic wastes oxygen. Analyze the situation. Survive. Asterisk, I scanned the area around us, my eyes straining to see the unseeable. I saw a faint shimmer in the air to our left, a distortion, like heat haze, a strand. Another one glinted briefly in a stray beam of sunlight to our right. We were boxed in, and then I saw it, the Weaver. It was emerging from a crack in the canyon wall about 50 meters up. It was beautiful in the most appalling way imaginable. Its body was a teardrop of polished obsidian, its 8 legs long, delicate spires of iridescent, pearlescent chitin. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like a dancer, its multiple, deep blue eyes regarding us with a cold alien intelligence. It was not a mindless beast. It was an engineer, an artist, whose medium was death. It began to descend, not on a thread, but by walking down the sheer rock face, its needle-sharp feet finding impossible holds. It was in no hurry. It knew we were not going anywhere. That moment was a turning point for me. I understood something fundamental about Charnel then. The world wasn't just trying to kill us with brute force. It wasn't just a chaotic maelstrom of tooth and claw. It was intelligent. It was creative. It was designing new and ever more efficient ways to eradicate us. The Glass Weaver was not just a monster. It was a weapon, a piece of biological ordnance, a masterpiece of murder. Rorik broke first. He screamed, a high, thin wail of pure terror, and scrambled backwards. He took 2 steps before 3 separate filaments, at different heights, did their work. He came apart like a badly made toy, his limbs and torso falling in a heap. The scream was cut off with sickening finality. Now it was just me and Lyra. The Weaver was halfway down the cliff face. I looked at her, and through her visor, I could see her eyes, wide with a terror that had gone beyond screaming. I made a decision. I unslung my Las rifle. "Don't move," I said, my voice barely a whisper into my comm. I fired. Not at the Weaver, it was too far, and its carapace would probably deflect the shot anyway. I fired at the rock face just above us, where I had seen the shimmer of the main anchor strands. The superheated rock exploded, and the filaments, their anchor points vaporized, snapped with an audible crack. For a second, a whole section of the web shimmered into visibility, a net of deadly light, before it fell away. We were free. We ran. We didn't look back. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, leaving the neatly packaged remains of our comrades for the Weaver to claim. We had survived, but the image of Jax and Rorik was seared into my brain. I see the Glass Weaver now, from my all-encompassing perspective. I see it spinning its lethal art in the silent canyons. I understand it now. It is not evil. It is not malicious. It is simply a part of the whole, a perfect expression of the world's nature. It is a gear in the great, grinding machine of Charnel's ecosystem. And I, who once feared it, am now its keeper. I am the rock from which it spins its thread. I am the gravity that holds its victims to the ground. I am the silence that follows its work. The slow, grinding decay of Bastion was not a sudden event, but a chronic illness, a creeping necrosis that we fought every single cycle. Our home was a relic, a machine built by our ancestors with technology we no longer fully understood. We were not its masters. We were its caretakers, its priests, performing rituals of maintenance and repair that we had learned by rote, without any real comprehension of the underlying principles. The spirit of the machine, as the tech priests on distant Mars would call it, was old and tired. The lumen strips flickered with a weary, inconsistent light, often plunging entire corridors into darkness for hours at a time. The air recyclers rattled and coughed, and the air they produced grew steadily staler, carrying a persistent, metallic tang of ozone and failing components. The nutrient paste dispensers would sometimes sputter and die, forcing us onto emergency rations of hard, tasteless protein bars that felt like chewing on compressed sawdust. Every day was a battle against entropy. My job as a condenser technician put me on the front lines of this war. The condensers were the heart of Bastion, the great, wheezing lungs that kept us all alive. They were a labyrinth of pipes, turbines, and pressure vessels, all of it ancient and temperamental. I knew their sounds the way a mother knows the breathing of her child. I could diagnose a failing gasket by the pitch of its hiss, a worn turbine by the rhythm of its vibration. I spent my days crawling through cramped access tunnels, my hands slick with grease, replacing worn parts, placating the groaning, resentful machine spirit with prayers and percussive maintenance. It was a losing battle. For every seal I replaced, 2 more would begin to fail. For every circuit I repaired, a new one would short out. We were patching a crumbling dam with our bare hands, and we could feel the pressure mounting. The boneyard, a cavern filled with broken machinery and scavenged parts, grew larger with every passing year. It was our monument to our own decline, a graveyard of our technological inheritance. We were no longer innovators, we were cannibals, stripping our dead for the parts we needed to keep the living on their feet for one more day. This slow, technological decay mirrored the decay in our own spirits. It fostered a deep-seated, pervasive anxiety, a constant, low-level fear that this cycle would be the one where something essential finally broke for good. What would we do if the main water pump failed? What if the primary air scrubber gave out? These were not abstract questions. We had drills for these scenarios. Grim, silent affairs where we practiced sealing off entire sections of the hab blocks, sacrificing a part of our home to save the rest. We were rehearsing our own amputation. The pressure of the impending tithe hung over us like a headsman's axe. The Imperial freighter was not a symbol of connection to the wider galaxy. It was a threat. It was a deadline. The demand for promethium was relentless, and our mines were running dry. The veins were deeper, the rock harder, the yields lower. The miners, led by brutes like Vorg, had to push their equipment and their bodies to the breaking point, taking greater and greater risks, causing more and more damage to the structural integrity of the lower levels. They were tearing our home apart from the inside out to pay a debt to a landlord who didn't know or care that his tenants were starving. Praetor Malachi's sermons grew harsher, his face ever more grim. His talks were less about endurance and more about sacrifice. The body is weak, he would say, his voice a low growl that filled the grand cistern. The machine is fallible. Our will is all we have. The tithe must be met. If a man must work until his heart bursts, he will do so. If a machine must be run until its core melts, it will be so. There is no alternative. The Imperium does not accept excuses. It only accepts payment, in metal or in blood. The sense of an ending was palpable. It was in the taste of the water, the quality of the air, the weary, haunted look in everyone's eyes. We were a people living on borrowed time, our candle burning down to the stub. The rituals and litanies that had once provided a sense of order and control now felt like the desperate prayers of the damned. We were going through the motions, but the belief, the faint flicker of faith in the system, was dying. I felt it in my own work. I was no longer just a technician. I was an archaeologist, studying the ruins of a forgotten age. I would find panels with faded, unreadable instructions written in a dialect of High Gothic I couldn't comprehend. I would find components so advanced, so far beyond our ability to replicate, that they might as well have been magic. We were like savages living in the ruins of a fallen empire, using its miraculous relics to perform our mundane, desperate tasks, all the while knowing that when they finally broke, we would have no way to fix them. The final years, before the quake, were defined by a quiet, pervasive desperation. The laughter of children was a sound rarely heard. The secret, hopeful conversations that Lena tried to start would wither and die in the oppressive silence. We were turning inward, our world shrinking to the size of our own individual struggles for survival. The community, the sense that we were all in this together, was beginning to fray. When a man's rebreather failed, his neighbor was more likely to see it as an opportunity to salvage a spare part than as a tragedy. We were regressing, shedding the thin veneer of civilization that Malachi had so carefully maintained, and the primal, selfish instincts of the cornered animal were beginning to surface. This is the truth of slow collapse. It is not a dramatic, fiery explosion. It is a quiet, creeping rot. It is the drip, drip, drip of a leaky pipe that slowly, inexorably, floods the entire ship. We were drowning, and we didn't even have the energy to scream. I feel the echoes of that decay now. The failing machines of Bastion are like phantom pains in my new, planetary body. I feel the groaning pipes as a tightness in a chest I no longer have. I feel the flickering lights as a stutter in a consciousness that should be eternal and unbroken. The sickness of Bastion is a part of me, a chronic, incurable disease in the heart of my new godhood. And I am its caretaker still, but now I understand the full, tragic scope of the task. I am not just maintaining a machine. I am preserving a memory, a monument to a species that was too stubborn to know it was already dead. The inciting incident, the moment our slow, managed decline spiraled into a frantic race against extinction, was not a monster or a storm. It was a whisper from the planet's deep places, a geological sigh that broke our world. We called it the root quake. It was not a normal tremor. Charnel's tectonic plates were relatively stable. This was something different, something biological. It began as a low, deep hum that vibrated up through the soles of our boots, a sound that was felt as much as it was heard. The hum grew in intensity over the course of a cycle, a rising crescendo that set our teeth on edge and made the very rock of Bastion feel like it was alive and groaning in pain. Then the shaking began. It was not the sharp, violent juddering of a tectonic shift, but a slow, rhythmic grinding motion, like the planet was being stirred by a giant hand. Tunnels twisted and warped. Support struts screamed and bent under the strain. Sections of the hab blocks collapsed, and the dust of 1,000 years was shaken loose, filling the air with a choking, blinding fog. The quake lasted for less than a minute, but in that minute, our reality was shattered. When the shaking stopped and the dust began to settle, a new sound emerged, the frantic, terrified screaming of the injured and the dying, and a sound far worse, the gushing, roaring sound of a massive water leak. The quake had cracked the grand cistern. Our heart, our temple, the very source of our life, was bleeding out into the deep, forgotten caverns below. I was in a low-level conduit, checking a pressure valve. When it hit, the tunnel around me contorted like a dying snake. I was thrown against the wall, my head connecting with a metal pipe with a sickening crack. For a moment, the world was a universe of white, searing pain. When my vision cleared, I saw that the main pipe I had been servicing, a conduit carrying purified water to the upper levels, had been sheared in two. A torrent of our most precious resource was vanishing into a newly formed fissure in the floor. The scale of the catastrophe became clear in the hours that followed. The grand cistern had lost over 60% of its water. The main pumps were damaged, and the lower levels, where the primary filtration systems were housed, were completely flooded with brackish, contaminated groundwater that had rushed in through the new cracks. We were cut off from our own lifeblood. Our reserves would last us less than a month, but the quake had brought another, more insidious horror. In the aftermath, as we surveyed the damage, we began to see it. A new form of life. It was a vine, a deep, blood-red crimson in color, covered in fine, hair-like thorns. It grew at an impossible, terrifying rate, pushing its way through the new fissures in the rock. It seemed to be drawn to our technology, to our heat and power sources. It would wrap around power conduits, and the conduits would short out, their energy seemingly drained by the plant. It would snake its way into ventilation shafts, choking them, filling them with a sweet, cloying scent that made you dizzy and nauseous. What was most terrifying was its apparent intelligence. A work crew trying to clear a blocked tunnel found their path cut off by a thick, thorny barrier of the vine that had not been there minutes before. When they tried to cut it with plasma torches, the vine would retreat, only to grow back in a different configuration, blocking their retreat. It was learning, it was adapting, it was hunting us. We were trapped. Our water was running out, our home was being invaded by a parasitic, intelligent plant, and the very rock beneath our feet could no longer be trusted. The old fears of monsters, of storms, of failing machines seemed almost quaint in comparison. This was an existential threat, a systematic dismantling of our entire world. The grim, ordered society of Bastion, fractured. Panic, the enemy Malachi had fought so hard to suppress, took hold. Fights broke out over rationed water. Work crews refused to enter the damaged lower levels, fearing both the unstable rock and the crimson vines. The litanies and rituals felt hollow, powerless against this new, multi-fronted war. We were a body suffering from a massive, traumatic injury, and now a virulent infection was setting in. Malachi tried to restore order. He stood in the cavern before the cracked, weeping wall of the grand cistern, his face a mask of iron control, but for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his good eye that I had never seen before: fear. Not for himself, but for the organism he had dedicated his life to preserving. He saw the system failing, the machine grinding to a halt, and he was powerless to stop it. His words, usually so full of grim certainty, now seemed desperate. "We will endure this," he roared, his voice straining to be heard over the terrified murmurs of the crowd. "We have endured worse. We will rebuild the cistern. We will purge this filth from our home. The work continues. The will of Bastion is unbroken." But it was broken. The quake had done more than crack our reservoir. It had cracked the foundations of our belief system. The philosophy of endurance was meaningless when there was nothing left to endure with. The work was pointless when the tools were broken and the resources gone. We were staring into the abyss, and for the first time, there was no comforting litany, no grim ritual to pull us back from the edge. The rootquake was the beginning of the end. It was the moment Charnel stopped trying to kill us with isolated attacks and began a coordinated, strategic campaign to utterly annihilate us. It was a declaration of war from the planet itself. And as I crawled through a ruptured, vine-choked conduit, my head throbbing, the sweet scent of the crimson creeper filling my senses, I knew that our old ways were not going to be enough. A new, desperate, and probably suicidal plan was needed. The slow, grinding war of attrition was over. The final, bloody battle for Bastion had begun. The Council of Elders convened in what was left of the command center, a chamber deep in the heart of Bastion that was now lit by the erratic, sputtering light of emergency power packs. The air was thick with the smell of dust and fear. Praetor Malachi stood before a holographic map of the settlement, a flickering, glitching image that showed vast sections of our home in angry, warning red. The other elders, old, weary men and women who were the heads of their respective departments, mining, hydroponics, engineering, sat slumped in their chairs, their faces gray with exhaustion and despair. I was there, not as an elder, but as a specialist. I had been one of the first to survey the damage to the water systems, and my report had been the final, damning piece of evidence that our situation was untenable. The primary pumps are submerged under at least 10 meters of contaminated water, I explained, my voice flat and clinical, a defense mechanism against the terror that was clawing at my own throat. Even if we could clear the flooding, the control mechanisms are fried, the filtration units are compromised. We can't purify the new groundwater. It's saturated with heavy metals and biological agents we've never seen before. The crimson vine seems to thrive in it. Rebuilding is not an option. We lack the parts, the power, and the time. A long, heavy silence followed my words. The truth was laid bare. We were dying of thirst in a flooded tomb. It was Lena who broke the silence. She had been brought in because her knowledge of Charnel's strange botany was now a matter of critical importance. She stepped forward, her face pale but her eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "There is another way," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The old stories, the first colonists. They didn't settle here. In the canyons, they settled on the high plateau, near the great peak they called the Spire. They built something there, the Echo Pylon. A murmur of disbelief and scorn went through the room. The Echo Pylon was a myth, a fairy tale told to frighten children, a great, humming tower from the dark age of technology, a place of strange energies and forgotten science. The area around it was said to be so saturated with radiation and biological horrors that nothing could survive there. A myth? Grunted Boren, the head of mining, a man whose face looked like a collapsed tunnel. A ghost story. No, Lena insisted, her voice rising with passion. The logs in the Central Archive, the fragmented ones, they mention it. They called it their last hope. They believed it could change the weather, that it could terraform, that it could make the rains clean and the land green. They failed to activate it, and that's why we are here, in this hole. But the pylon is still there. If we could reach it, if we could make it work, it could save us all. Malachi turned his one good eye on her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studying her, his gaze weighing her impossible hope against the crushing reality of our situation. I expected him to dismiss her out of hand, to deliver a brutal, withering speech about the poison of false hope. But he did not. Instead, he looked at the dying map, at the spreading red stain of the crimson vine, at the blinking icon that showed our water reserves dropping with every passing second. He was a pragmatist, and the pragmatic truth was that we were out of logical options. All that was left was the illogical, the impossible. The plateau is a 3-day journey across the most hostile territory on this world, Malachi said, his voice a low rasp. Through the Glassweaver canyons and the razor grass plains. No one has made that journey in 5 generations. We have to try, Lena pleaded. What choice do we have? To stay here and wait for the vines to choke us or the thirst to kill us? Malachi was silent for another long minute. I could almost hear the calculations turning in his mind, the grim calculus of survival. A mission to the pylon was almost certain death for those who went, but to do nothing was certain death for everyone. He was choosing between a quick, violent execution for a few, and a slow, agonizing one for all. It was not a choice at all. Very well, he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. We will commit this final folly. A team will be assembled. They will be given our best remaining equipment and a week's worth of rations and water. They will go to this Echo Pylon. They will either activate it and save us, or they will die, and we will follow them shortly after. The decision was made. The suicide mission was approved. The room then turned to the question of who would go. Names were proposed and discarded. We needed our best. A navigator who knew the old surface paths, a weapons expert who could handle the fauna, an engineer who might have a chance of understanding the pylon systems, if they could even get inside. And my name was mentioned. I was young, I was a competent technician, and I was expendable enough. Before I could process it, Malachi's gaze fell on me. Kale, you will go. Your knowledge of our failing systems may give you an insight into the old ones. It was not a request. It was a death sentence, delivered as a field promotion. And then, to my horror, Lena spoke again, her voice unwavering. I will go too. I know the lore. I know the research. I can guide them. A heated argument erupted. She was too valuable, the head of hydroponics argued. She was a civilian, not a survivor, Boren grunted. But Lena stood her ground, her face set with a determination that was terrifying to behold. And Malachi, surprisingly, agreed. Her belief may be a delusion, he said, but a strong delusion is its own form of weapon. She goes. One more name was added, Vorg, the brute from the mines. We needed his strength, his savagery. He was a monster, but we were sending a team into a world of monsters. He would be our attack dog. The team was set. Me, the technician, Lena, the dreamer, Vorg, the killer, and 2 other veterans, a navigator and a heavy weapons specialist, whose names I knew would soon be added to the memorial wall. As the meeting broke up, and the elders shuffled out to deliver the grim news to our dying community, I was left alone in the flickering light of the command center, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I was being sent on a fool's errand, a desperate pilgrimage to a mythical machine, in the company of a zealot and a psychopath. It was the ultimate cosmic joke. My entire life had been about cautious, methodical survival. And now, my life was to be thrown away on the longest of long shots, a one-in-a-million chance based on a half-remembered fairy tale. I looked at the holographic map, at the small, blinking icon of Bastion, a tiny island of light in a vast, encroaching sea of darkness. We were a dying star, and this mission was our final, desperate, pathetic flare of light before we were extinguished forever. The preparation for our departure was a somber, ritualistic affair. Bastion, in its final days, had become a ghost of itself. The corridors hushed, the work cycles abandoned. The remaining citizens moved with a slow, aimless listlessness, their faces etched with a profound, waiting dread. Our mission was not a secret. It was the community's last, desperate prayer, and we were the unwilling saints being sent on a pilgrimage from which no one expected us to return. We were given the best of what little was left. Our reinforced coveralls were patched and repatched, but the reclamation seals were new, a luxury we hadn't seen in years. Our rebreathers were fitted with fresh filters, their indicator lights glowing a healthy, vibrant green that seemed obscene in the dying light of the maintenance bay. We were each issued a standard pattern las rifle, its power pack fully charged, and a combat knife whose edge had been honed to a monomolecular sharpness. Vorg, in addition to his rifle, was given a heavy flamer, a weapon of last resort, its twin Promethium tanks a heavy, sloshing burden on his back. He hefted it with a grim satisfaction, a flicker of something that might have been joy in his cold, dead eyes. The two veterans assigned to our team were a man named Cassian and a woman named Ilara. Cassian was our navigator, a wiry, silent man whose face was a mask of scar tissue, a testament to a long and brutal life on the surface. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, and he spoke only when absolutely necessary, his words clipped and precise. Ilara was our heavy weapons expert, a stern, broad-shouldered woman with a bionic arm that whirred softly with every movement. She was cynical, pragmatic, and radiated an aura of weary competence. They were professionals, old soldiers being sent on one last, hopeless campaign. Our supplies were meager, concentrated nutrient bars, enough for 7 cycles, 6 water flasks each, filled from the purest part of the cistern's remaining reserves. The water felt impossibly heavy on my back, a tangible weight of our community's dying hope. We had medical kits filled with synth skin applicators and pain suppressants, a multi-tool for repairs, and a voxcaster that we all knew would be useless once we were out of range of Bastion's weak signal. We were a tiny, self-contained bubble of life, about to be launched into an ocean of death. The final farewells were unspoken, communicated through glances and gestures. The other technicians in my section gave me solemn, respectful nods, their eyes saying what their mouths could not. They were saluting a dead man. I saw Praetor Malachi one last time. He met me at the great blast doors of the main entrance, the portal that led to the surface. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "Do not be deceived by the dreamer's hope," he said, his voice a low rumble, for my ears alone. "And do not be tempted by the brute savagery. You are a technician, Kale, a man of logic. Your task is not to fight the world, but to understand the machine, the pylon. That is your only purpose. Do not fail." It was the closest he had ever come to encouragement, a grim, functional pep talk from a man who saw the universe as a series of equations to be solved. Then I saw Lena. She was saying goodbye to her friends from hydroponics, who were pressing small, dried fungal charms into her hand. When she saw me, she smiled, a fragile, brilliant thing in the gloom. The smile tore at something deep inside me. It was so out of place, so full of a life and a hope that had no right to exist here. It felt like a crime. "We're going to do it, Kale," she said, her voice a fervent whisper. "I can feel it. We're going to save them all." I could not meet her eyes. Her faith was a physical weight, a burden far heavier than the pack on my back. It was a promise I knew I could not keep. The great blast doors began to grind open, the sound of a tomb being unsealed. A wave of hot, metallic-smelling air washed over us, the foul breath of charnel. The coppery glare of the twin suns spilled into the corridor, making us squint. It was time. We walked out onto the landing platform, a sheet of rust-colored rock that overlooked the vast, alien landscape. The world was a panorama of jagged canyons, twisted rock formations, and sickly, bruised skies. The silence was absolute, a profound and terrifying emptiness after the constant hum of Bastion's machinery. We were truly, utterly alone. As we prepared to descend the switchback path that led to the canyon floor, I took one last look back at the entrance to Bastion. It was just a dark hole in the side of a mountain, an insignificant wound on an impossibly vast and hostile creature. I saw the faces of my people, small, pale circles in the darkness, watching us go. I was leaving the only home I had ever known, a prison that was, for all its flaws, my sanctuary. And I was walking into a world that had been trying to kill me since the day I was born. The blast doors groaned shut behind us, the sound echoing through the canyons, a final, metallic sob of farewell. The link was cut. We were on our own. 5 small figures against a world of monsters. The suicide mission had begun. The moment we stepped off the manufactured rockcrete of the landing platform and onto the natural, treacherous soil of charnel, the world asserted its dominance. The ground beneath our boots was not stable earth, but a loose, shifting scree of volcanic glass and sun-baked clay that threatened to send you tumbling with every step. The air, even through the filters of my rebreather, was thick with the taste of sulfur and something else, a sweet, cloying odor of alien decay that clung to the back of the throat. The silence was the most unnerving part. In Bastion, life was a constant symphony of machinery, the hum of the recyclers, the clang of the workshops, the hiss of the pipes. It was the sound of our survival. Out here, the silence was a living thing, a predatory presence. It was the sound of a world holding its breath, waiting for you to make a mistake. The only noises were the crunch of our boots on the scree, the whisper of the wind through the rock formations, and the sound of our own breathing, amplified in the confines of our helmets into a loud, panicked roar. We were intruders here, a discordant note in a silent, deadly symphony. Cassian, our silent navigator, took the lead, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape, reading the subtle signs in the rock and the wind that were invisible to the rest of us. He led us down the treacherous switchback path, his movements economical and precise. Alara followed him, her bionic arm whirring softly as she kept her heavy las rifle at a low ready, her head on a constant swivel. Vorg came next, the flamer on his back seeming to pull him forward, his gait an aggressive, impatient stomp. Then came Lena, her movements hesitant but determined, her eyes wide as she took in the terrifying, majestic panorama of her world for the first time. I brought up the rear, my mind a whirl of technical data and gnawing fear, my primary role for now being to watch our backs. The first leg of our journey was through the foothills of the main canyon range, a landscape of twisted, wind-carved rock spires that looked like the bones of colossal, forgotten beasts. The twin suns beat down on us, the heat so intense it felt like a physical pressure. Sweat slicked my body inside my coveralls, and the reclamation system, designed for the cool, stable environment of the tunnels, struggled to keep up. Within the first hour, I felt a deep, profound exhaustion settle into my bones. This was not the weariness of a long work shift. This was a fundamental, existential fatigue, the feeling of your body being actively rejected by the environment. Every step was a conscious act of will, a small rebellion against a planet that wanted you to lie down and die. We saw our first sign of Charnel's native life a few hours in. Cassian held up a hand, and we all froze. He pointed to a ridge above us. A pack of skitter claws, low-slung, 6-legged reptilian creatures, were watching us. Their skin was the color and texture of the rock, a perfect camouflage. The only thing that gave them away was the faint, heat-haze shimmer of the air around them, a product of their incredibly high body temperature. They were not an immediate threat, they were scavengers, not frontline predators, but their presence was a reminder. We were being watched, we were being assessed, we were being added to the local menu. The psychological toll of the journey began almost immediately. The vast, open spaces, after a lifetime in claustrophobic tunnels, were agoraphobia-inducing. The sky was a vast, oppressive ceiling that offered no comfort, only the threat of razor winds and acid rain. The constant, 360-degree exposure to potential threats wore on the nerves. In Bastion, danger came from predictable directions. Here, it could come from above, from below, from the very rock you were standing on. My mind, trained to see the world as a series of contained, manageable systems, struggled to process the sheer, chaotic scale of it all. I felt like a microbe on the skin of a god. As the cycle wore on, and Viridia, the red giant, began its slow, majestic descent, the landscape began to change. The shadows grew long and distorted, turning the familiar rock formations into menacing, alien shapes. The temperature began to drop rapidly, and the wind picked up, its mournful howl a harbinger of the cinder night to come. Cassian led us to a small, defensible overhang, a shallow cave that would offer some protection from the wind and the predators of the night. "We make camp here," he said, his first words in hours. The process was grimly efficient. Alara set up perimeter alerts, small sonic devices that would emit a piercing shriek if anything broke their field. Vorg checked the area for burrowing creatures, stamping on the ground with his heavy boots. Lena, ever the botanist, examined the strange, crystalline lichen that grew on the cave walls, while I ran a diagnostic on our suit batteries and rebreather filters. There was no fire, no comforting warmth. We sat in the cold, sterile light of cinder, the white dwarf, which cast our shadows as sharp, black daggers against the cave wall. We ate our nutrient bars in silence, the act of chewing a loud, obnoxious intrusion into the profound quiet. The conversation, when it finally came, was strained. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Lena whispered, her gaze fixed on the star-dusted violet sky, a sight we never saw from inside Bastion. "It's a hole," Vorg grunted, not looking up from cleaning his knife. "A bigger, emptier hole than the one we just left." "She's right," Alara said, her voice a low murmur. "It is beautiful. That's the trap. Charnel's most dangerous weapon isn't its teeth. It's the moments of beauty that make you drop your guard." I said nothing. I was watching the energy readings on my suit's display. My mind focused on the data. Energy levels, oxygen consumption, suit integrity. These were the things that mattered. Beauty was an irrelevant variable in the equation of survival. But as I sat there, a cold, hard knot of fear in my stomach, I couldn't help but glance out at the alien vista. The silver light of cinder painted the canyons in shades of bone white and obsidian black. The wind sang its lonely, haunting song. It was a landscape of pure, terrifying, sublime desolation. And I felt a strange, unwelcome thought surface. Alara was right. The beauty was the most terrifying part of all. It was the beautiful, serene face of a serial killer, and we had just accepted its invitation to come inside. The first night was a test, and the first lesson was that on Charnel, sleep is a luxury you cannot afford. The cinder night was not a true darkness, but a landscape painted in shades of death. The cold was a physical presence, a creeping entity that sought out the smallest flaw in our suit's heating systems, the tiniest gap in our thermal insulation. We huddled together in the shallow cave, not for comfort, but for shared thermal efficiency, a group of shivering mammals trying to outlast the coming of an ice age. Sleep was impossible. We rested in shifts, 2 on watch while the others entered a state of low-power torpor, their suit systems dimmed to conserve energy. My first watch was with Alara. We sat at the mouth of the cave, our rifles across our laps, our eyes scanning the monochrome wasteland before us. The silence of the day had been replaced by the sounds of the night, a chorus of clicks, whispers, and scuttling noises that echoed strangely in the thin, cold air. The night predators of Charnel were on the hunt. "You're tense, Kale," Alara said, her voice a low murmur that was almost lost in the wind. "Breathe. Long, slow breaths." Panicked, breathing ices up the rebreather. I tried to follow her advice, but my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a stalking footstep. I'm not built for this, I admitted, the words a confession. I'm a technician. I fix things. I understand closed systems, predictable variables. This, I gestured to the vast chaotic emptiness. This is just noise. I can't process it. Nobody's built for this, she replied, her bionic hand clenching and unclenching in a repetitive, rhythmic motion. You just get used to it. You learn to filter the noise. You learn to listen to the silence between the sound. That's where the real danger is. As if on cue, a high-pitched scream echoed from a distant canyon, a sound of pure agony that was abruptly cut off. A profound, listening silence followed. Scythe Maw, Alara said, her voice devoid of emotion. Found something. The casual, matter-of-fact way she said it was more chilling than the scream itself. This was her normal. This symphony of death was the soundtrack to her life. Lena, who was supposed to be resting, stirred behind us. How can you live like this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. How can anyone? We don't live. Vorg's voice rumbled from the back of the cave, where he was on his rest shift, though I doubted he was asleep. We wait. We wait for our turn to scream. His words hung in the cold air, a perfect, brutal summary of our existence. The tension within our small group was as palpable as the cold. We were not a team. We were a collection of desperate, incompatible individuals shackled together by a hopeless mission. Lena's idealism, which had seemed like a brave act of rebellion in Bastion, felt like a dangerous, naive liability out here. Vorg's cynical brutality, a necessary evil in the mines, felt like a cancer that would consume us from within. Cassian's silence was a wall we couldn't penetrate. Ilara's weary professionalism was a form of resignation, a quiet acceptance of her own impending death. And I was the fulcrum, the uncertain center, caught between all these opposing forces. I was beginning to have strange dreams. In the brief, shallow periods of rest I managed to snatch, my mind would conjure feverish, fragmented visions. I dreamt of the crimson vine from Bastion, but in my dream, it was growing inside me, its thorns hooking into my ribs, its sweet, cloying scent filling my lungs. I dreamt of the echo pylon, not as a machine of metal and circuits, but as a great, pulsating organ of flesh and bone, humming a song that vibrated in my teeth. I would wake with a start, my heart pounding, the phantom sensation of thorns in my chest. The lines between the waking world and the nightmare were beginning to blur. The first real test came near the end of our watch. One of Alara's sonic perimeter alerts went off, a piercing, high-frequency shriek that jolted everyone to full alertness. We grabbed our weapons, our backs to the cave wall, peering into the cinder-lit gloom. For a long time, there was nothing but the howling wind. Then we saw them, a pack of gloomstalkers. They were canine-like creatures, but their bodies were unnaturally thin and elongated, their movements disturbingly fluid, like ink flowing over the rocks. Their most terrifying feature was their skin, which was a matte, non-reflective black that seemed to drink the faint light, making them appear as holes in reality, moving patches of absolute darkness. They circled our position, their forms weaving in and out of the shadows, their silence more terrifying than any growl. They were testing our defenses, looking for a weak point. Steady, Ilara commanded, her voice a low, calming force. Don't fire unless they charge. We can't afford to waste the energy. The standoff felt like an eternity. The stalkers were masters of psychological warfare. They would dart forward, then retreat, their movements designed to make us flinch, to waste a shot, to reveal our position more clearly. Lena was shaking, her rifle held in a white-knuckled grip. Vorg, on the other hand, was a coiled spring of violent energy, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his finger caressing the trigger of his flamer. Let me burn them, he hissed. Let me light up this whole damn canyon. Negative, Alara snapped. You'll give away our position to everything for 5 clicks. Hold your discipline. The lead stalker, a creature larger than the rest, finally made its move. It didn't charge. It simply flowed forward, a river of shadow, its movements impossibly fast. Before any of us could react, Cassian, who had been as still as a statue, moved. He didn't fire his rifle. He threw his combat knife. The blade, a sliver of silver in the cinder light, spun through the air and embedded itself in the creature's eye socket with a soft thud. The stalker collapsed without a sound, its body dissolving into a puddle of viscous, black ichor. The rest of the pack, their leader gone, hesitated for a moment, then melted back into the shadows and were gone. Silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Cassian walked out, retrieved his knife, and wiped it clean on his trousers before returning to his position, his face an unreadable mask. He had not said a word. The incident was over in seconds, but it left us all shaken. It was a stark, brutal lesson in the realities of this world. Our technology, our rifles, were loud, clumsy things. The true weapons of survival were silence, speed, and a deep, instinctual understanding of the enemy. Cassian had it. The rest of us were just tourists, blundering through a war zone we did not understand. As the first, faint, sickly green rays of Viridia's dawn began to light the eastern sky, we packed up our meager camp. No one spoke of what had happened. There was no need. We were all alive. But the night had taken its toll. It had stripped away another layer of our hope, another layer of our humanity, leaving us colder, harder, and more afraid than before. The journey had just begun, and we were already starting to come apart at the seams. The second cycle of our journey brought with it a change in terrain and a new, more insidious kind of horror. We descended from the rocky foothills into the razor grass plains, a vast undulating sea of what looked like tall, silvery grass. From a distance, it was strangely beautiful, shimmering in the twin sun's light, like a field of liquid metal. Up close, it was a death trap. Each blade of grass was a silicate-based organism, and its edges were honed to a monomolecular sharpness. They were, in effect, millions upon millions of stationary razors, planted in the ground. A strong gust of wind could turn the entire plain into a storm of invisible, flying blades. To fall into a patch of razor grass was to be flensed, your flesh and muscle stripped from your bones in a matter of seconds. Cassian led us along a narrow, winding ridge of bare rock that cut through the plains, a precarious spine in a sea of knives. We had to walk in single file, our feet placed carefully, one in front of the other. A single misstep, a moment of imbalance, would mean a horrifying death. The wind was our primary antagonist. It would rise without warning, a low moan that grew into a high-pitched shriek, and the grass would begin to sway and dance. With each gust, we would have to flatten ourselves against the rock, shielding our heads with our arms as tiny, invisible fragments of the grass, broken off by the wind, filled the air. We could hear them tinkling against our helmets, a sound like fine, sharp rain. It was a journey of 1,000 tiny cuts. Despite our precautions, the wind-borne fragments found their way into the joints of our suits, into the seams of our gloves. Our skin was soon covered in a network of fine, shallow cuts that stung and itched relentlessly. The landscape offered no shelter, no place to rest. We just had to keep moving, a slow, agonizing procession across the shimmering, silver expanse. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological strain was worse. It was the tension of 1,000 near misses, the constant, low-grade fear of a single, fatal mistake. This was Charnel's style of attrition, grinding you down not with a single, dramatic blow, but with a relentless series of small, wearing tortures. It was during the crossing of the razor grass plains that we suffered our first major loss. It was not a death, but a prelude to it. Alara, the stoic, competent soldier, made a mistake. A sudden, violent gust of wind caught her off balance. She stumbled, her foot slipping off the narrow rock path. She fell into the grass. Her scream was not one of pain, but of pure, shocked surprise. It was cut off almost immediately. Vorg, who was behind her, reacted with a speed and brutality that was shocking. He didn't hesitate. He didn't try to reach for her. He unslung his flamer, took aim, and unleashed a torrent of burning promethium into the patch of grass where she had fallen. The grass ignited with an explosive, whooshing sound, burning with an intense, white-hot flame that consumed everything in a 10-meter radius. The scream that came from the heart of the fire was no longer human. It was a sound of such profound, unimaginable agony that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. It was the sound of a soul being burned out of existence. The fire died down as quickly as it had started, leaving a blackened, smoking circle of fused silica on the ground. Of Alara, there was nothing left. Not a bone, not a piece of her suit, nothing. Just the lingering, sickeningly sweet smell of cooked meat and melted plasteel. We stood there, frozen in horrified silence. Lena was openly weeping, her body racked with sobs. Cassian stood as still as the rock beneath his feet, his face unreadable. I felt a cold, sick emptiness in the pit of my stomach. Vorg swung the flamer off his back, its nozzle still smoking. He looked at us, his eyes cold and hard, a mixture of defiance and grim justification. "What?" he snarled. "You wanted to go in after her? You wanted to listen to her scream for the next hour while the grass stripped her to the bone?" I gave her a mercy. It was the only one available. His logic was brutal. It was monstrous. And it was, in the twisted, nightmarish context of Charnel, undeniably correct. He had not killed her out of malice, but out of a terrible, pragmatic necessity. He had saved her from a worse fate. He had also saved us from the psychological torment of listening to her die. It was the act of a monster, but it was also the act of a survivor. The incident shattered what little cohesion our group had left. Lena looked at Vorg with open, unadulterated hatred. "You're a beast," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "You're no different from the things that hunt us." "That's why I'm still alive, little dreamer." Vorg shot back, his lip curling in a sneer. "And you're next, if you don't start seeing this place for what it is." From that moment on, we were no longer a team. We were three factions. Lena, the broken idealist. Vorg, the pragmatic monster. And me and Cassian, the silent, shattered middle ground, just trying to keep moving. The death of Alara, and the manner of it, was a turning point. It was the moment I realized that the true monsters of Charnel were not the scythe maws or the glass weavers. The true monster was the world itself, and the things it forced you to become in order to survive it. It presented you with impossible choices, with scenarios where the only right answer was an act of profound, soul-destroying horror. Vorg had not just killed Alara, he had killed a part of all of us. He had shown us the price of survival, and it was a price that cost you your own humanity. As we continued our slow, grim march across the plains, the silver grass shimmering around us, I felt a part of myself die. The technician, the man who believed in systems and solutions, was gone. In his place was something colder, something harder, something that looked at the burning circle where a human being had just been vaporized and thought, with a chilling clarity, asterisk, he was right. It was the logical choice. Asterisk. The world was remaking me in its own image, and I was too tired, too scared, to fight it anymore. The wound that began my final, irreversible transformation was, like so many of the world's cruelties, a small and seemingly insignificant thing. After the horror of the razor-grass plains, we entered a region Cassian called the Fungal Canyons. It was a labyrinth of narrow, twisting gorges, where the rock was covered in a thick, carpet-like layer of phosphorescent moss that cast an eerie, green-blue light. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was a relief from the heat and the wind of the plains, but it was a suffocating, claustrophobic environment that felt more like the tunnels of Bastion than the open surface. The primary danger here was not predators, but the plant life itself. The canyon was a garden of biological warfare. There were fungi that released clouds of hallucinogenic spores if you got too close, filling your mind with terrifying phantoms. There were slime molds that could crawl up your legs and secrete a powerful acid that would eat through your suit. And there were the spore thorn. They were a type of woody, vine-like plant that grew in the crevices of the rock. They were covered in long, needle-sharp thorns that were hollow and filled with a cocktail of neurotoxins and reproductive spores. The slightest touch would cause the thorn to break off in your skin, injecting its payload directly into your bloodstream. We were navigating a particularly narrow section of the canyon. The mossy walls so close they brushed against our shoulders. When it happened, I was distracted, my mind still replaying the horrific death of Alara, the sound of her final scream echoing in my memory. I leaned against the wall for a moment to catch my breath, my arm brushing against a cluster of what I thought was just dried brush. I felt a sharp, sudden sting in my forearm, through the reinforced fabric of my suit. I looked down and saw a single, long, black thorn embedded in my arm, just below the elbow. The area around it was already beginning to turn a dark, bruised purple. "Throne of Earth," I hissed, my blood running cold. I pulled the thorn out, a foolish, panicked reaction. A tiny, almost invisible cloud of green dust puffed out from the wound. The spores. I had just released them directly into my own compromised suit. Cassian was at my side instantly. He grabbed my arm, his face a grim mask. He pulled a decontaminant wipe from his medkit and scrubbed at the wound, but we both knew it was too late. The spores were already in my bloodstream, in the localized atmosphere of my suit. "Med scanner," he ordered, his voice tight. I activated the small diagnostic tool on my wrist. The screen flickered to life, and a string of red text scrolled across it. "Biological agent detected. Unknown strain. Systemic infection imminent. Recommended action. Amputation." Vorg laughed, a short, harsh, ugly sound. "Looks like you're turning into one of Lena's pretty flowers, technician." Lena rushed to my side, her face pale with concern. "Can we do anything?" she asked Cassian. "The medkit has a broad-spectrum antitoxin," he said, pulling out a syringe. "It might slow it down. It might do nothing. We've never seen a reaction this fast." He injected the contents of the syringe into my arm. For a moment, there was a searing, burning pain, and then nothing. The purple bruising didn't recede. The warning on my scanner didn't disappear. I felt a strange, cold numbness spreading from the wound, a precursor to the fever that I knew was coming. My mission, my life, was now on a clock. The infection began its work with a terrifying speed. Within a few hours, a raging fever took hold. My body was racked with alternating fits of shivering, cold, and burning heat. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. But the physical symptoms were the least of it. The truly terrifying changes were happening in my mind, in my very perception of the world. The green-blue light of the phosphorescent moss seemed to become brighter, more vibrant. I could see subtle, intricate patterns in its growth that I hadn't noticed before. The sweet, cloying smell of the canyon, which had been nauseating, now seemed pleasant, comforting, even. I began to hear things, not voices, but a low, persistent hum, a thrumming vibration that seemed to be coming from the rock, from the plants, from the very air around me. It felt like the sound of the world's blood, pumping through its geological veins. I kept the worst of it to myself. I told the others that the antitoxin was working, that the fever was breaking. To admit the truth would be to sign my own death warrant. In the brutal calculus of our survival, a sick, delirious team member was a liability. Vorg was already watching me with a predatory gleam in his eyes, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He was just waiting for me to become too weak to defend myself. But a strange thing was happening. Despite the fever, despite the encroaching delirium, in some ways, I felt more alive, more aware than I ever had before. My senses were heightened, sharpened to an impossible degree. I could smell the subtle chemical differences between the different types of fungi. I could feel the minute shifts in air pressure that heralded a change in the weather. I could almost feel the life teeming in the rock around me, the slow, patient, and utterly alien consciousness of the planet's flora. I was becoming connected to the world that was killing me. The spore thorn had not just poisoned me. It had planted a seed. It was rewriting my biology, my neurology, turning me from an intruder into something else. I was a host for a new form of life, and it was beginning to integrate my systems into its own. The line between Kale, the technician from Bastion, and Charnel, the living world, was beginning to blur. I was terrified. But beneath the terror, there was a new, horrifying, and strangely seductive sensation, a feeling of belonging. For the first time in my life, I was not fighting the world. I was becoming a part of it. The internal conflict that had defined me, the battle between hope and despair, logic and instinct, was being replaced by a new, more fundamental struggle. the battle between my humanity and the encroaching, silent, green consciousness of the planet. My transformation was an insidious, creeping dawn. The fever became a constant, low-grade hum in my blood, a new baseline for my existence. The physical symptoms receded, replaced by a profound and unsettling shift in my sensory perception. The world, once a hostile and alien landscape, was beginning to feel familiar. The boundary between myself and my environment grew porous, indistinct. When the wind blew, I felt it not just on the surface of my suit, but as a phantom sensation on skin I could no longer directly feel, as if the wind were moving through me. I could feel the subtle vibrations in the ground through the soles of my boots, not as mere tremors, but as a kind of language, a slow, geological speech that told of deep-flowing water and the movement of burrowing creatures. The most profound change was in my relationship with the planet's flora, the crimson vine, the razor grass, the phosphorescent moss. I no longer saw them as individual, hostile species. I began to perceive them as a single, interconnected system, a vast, planetary network of roots and mycelia, a global brain of silent, green intelligence. The spore thorn's payload was not a simple poison. It was a key, a biological cipher that was unlocking my human neurology and allowing it to interface with this network. I started to understand things without knowing how I knew them. As Cassian navigated a treacherous maze of ravines, I found myself anticipating the path, sensing where the rock was unstable, where a hidden chasm lay concealed by a thin crust of earth. "How did you know that was there?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion, after I stopped him from stepping onto a section of ground that collapsed a moment later into a deep pit. I had no answer. "I just felt it," I said, a lame and inadequate explanation for a truth I could barely comprehend myself. The hum I had first heard in the fungal canyons was now a constant companion, a symphony of bioelectrical and geothermal energy that was the planet's lifeblood. At times, it would resolve into something that felt like thought. Not thought in the human sense, not words or images, but pure, raw impulses. Hunger, growth, patience. An ancient, terrifying patience that measured time in epochs, not in heartbeats. I was a receiver, my brain a crude antenna picking up the faint, powerful broadcast of a planetary consciousness. My dreams were no longer nightmares of being consumed, but strange, ecstatic visions of union. I dreamt I was a root, pushing deep into the warm, dark earth, drawing sustenance from the rock. I dreamt I was a spore, riding the high winds, seeing the world from a god's perspective, a patchwork of desert, jungle, and shimmering plains. I dreamt I was the crimson vine, feeling the thrum of energy in Bastion's power conduits, a sweet, irresistible nectar. I would wake from these dreams not with terror, but with a strange sense of peace, a feeling of having come home. The Kale, who was a technician from Bastion, the man who worried about quotas and leaky pipes, was fading. His memories, his fears, his desires, they were becoming distant, like the half-remembered story of someone else's life. In his place, something new was growing, a consciousness that was both me and not me, a hybrid entity that thought in terms of root systems and weather patterns, of predation and symbiosis. My companions noticed the change. I grew more and more silent, my gaze often fixed on the horizon, my attention seemingly captured by things they could not see or hear. Lena, with her innate empathy, saw it as a sign of my sickness worsening. She would look at me with pity and concern, offering me her own dwindling water supply, an act of kindness that felt like it was directed at a ghost. Vorg, with his animal cunning, saw it for what it was, a transformation. He saw me not as a sick man, but as a rival predator, a new and unknown variable in the brutal equation of survival. He watched me with a new kind of intensity, a mixture of fear and predatory curiosity. He no longer taunted me. He was wary of me. He knew I was becoming something other, something that might no longer be bound by the rules of human conflict. The irony was a constant, bitter taste in my non-existent mouth. I had been sent on a mission to understand a machine that could save my people. Instead, I was being transformed into a part of the biological machine that was trying to kill them. I was a spy who had been captured, brainwashed, and was now falling in love with the enemy. My internal monologue, the voice that had been my constant companion throughout my life, was now a chorus. There was the fading voice of Kale, clinging desperately to the concepts of loyalty, of humanity, of the mission. And then there was the other voice, a silent, green, and powerful upwelling from the planet itself. A voice that spoke of cycles, of consumption, of integration, of a peace that was indistinguishable from annihilation. The struggle between these two forces was tearing me apart. One day, while we rested in the shadow of a great rock spire, I looked at my hands. Through the grime on my gauntlets, I could see the skin of my forearm. A fine, green, moss-like growth was spreading from the wound, following the lines of my veins. It was not a rash, it was a cultivation. The world was planting its garden in me. I looked up at the bruised, violent sky, at the hostile, alien landscape, and I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, terrifying, and overwhelming sense of recognition. The prodigal son was returning home. The death of Hope on Charnel was not a quiet, dignified affair. It was a frantic, ugly, and pathetic spectacle. And its name was Lena. Her idealism, a fragile flame that had somehow survived the suffocating darkness of Bastion, was not equipped for the harsh, reality-drenched winds of the surface. Every step of the journey, every horror we witnessed, had chipped away at her spirit. Alara's brutal death, Vorg's monstrous pragmatism, my own creeping, unnatural transformation, it was all too much. The dreamer was being bludgeoned into a state of shock by a world that had no place for dreams. Her breakdown began subtly. The stories she used to tell, the whispers of garden worlds and blue skies, ceased. Her conversations, once full of a desperate, vibrant energy, dwindled into monosyllabic responses. She walked with her head down, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if afraid to look at the world around her anymore. She was retreating into herself, building a fortress of silence against a reality she could no longer bear. The breaking point came as we were crossing a vast, salt-white desert, a region that had once been an ancient sea. The heat was immense, a physical, crushing weight. The air shimmered, creating mirages that danced on the horizon, cruel ghosts of water and shade in a land defined by their absence. My new, heightened senses could feel the profound and ancient thirst of the land, a thirst so deep it felt like a hole in the universe. But Lena's senses were human, and they were failing her. She stopped dead in the middle of the salt flat, her body trembling. She raised a shaking hand and pointed to the horizon. "Look," she whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse. "There. Can't you see it? Trees. A river. It's green." We all looked. There was nothing but the shimmering, heat-hazed expanse of white salt. "It's a mirage, Lena," Cassian said, his voice flat, but with a rare, almost imperceptible note of pity. "There's nothing there. We need to keep moving." But she wouldn't listen. A frantic, manic light had entered her eyes. The strain of her long-suppressed hope had finally broken through the dam of her despair. But it was no longer a gentle stream. It was a raging, irrational flood. "No," she cried, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "You're lying. You all want to keep me here. You want me to die in this hell. But I won't. I'm going home." Before any of us could react, she started to run. She tore off across the salt flat, a small, pathetic figure running towards a phantom salvation, her feet kicking up puffs of white dust. "Lena, no," I screamed, the old, human part of me surging to the surface in a wave of pure, desperate panic. I started to run after her, but my body felt heavy, sluggish. Vorg grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Let her go," he grunted. "She's already dead. Don't you die with her." I struggled against him, but it was no use. And then the other part of me, the cold, green, planetary consciousness, asserted itself. It did not feel panic. It did not feel grief. It felt a detached curiosity. It analyzed the situation, the running figure, the instability of the salt crust, the vibrations from below. I knew what was going to happen. I could feel it through the soles of my boots. The ground beneath Lena's running feet began to darken, to look wet. She was running over a thin salt crust that covered a deep, subterranean bog of thick, viscous brine. "It's a trap," I whispered, the words coming out with a chilling, dispassionate calm. She didn't get far. With a loud crack, the salt crust gave way beneath her. She plunged up to her waist in the thick, gray mud. She screamed, a sound of pure, animal terror, and began to struggle, but her frantic movements only served to pull her deeper into the mire. And then the trees she had seen began to move. They were not trees. They were the appendages of a creature we had only heard stories about. A salt maw, great, white, branch-like limbs, perfectly camouflaged against the salt, rose from the bog around her. They were covered in what looked like sharp, crystalline thorns, which were actually mouths, thousands of tiny, needle-toothed orifices that opened and closed in a horrifying, silent chorus. The appendages wrapped around her, their movements slow, deliberate, almost gentle. We were too far away to help. Even if we had been closer, to step onto the brine bog would have been suicide. All we could do was watch. Lena didn't scream anymore. She just stared up at the bruised, indifferent sky, her face a mask of utter, soul-shattering disillusionment. The dreamer had finally woken up, and her waking world was a nightmare from which there was no escape. The salt maw's limbs tightened around her, and the tiny mouths began their work. Her suit, her flesh, her very essence, was slowly, methodically rasped away, dissolving into a red-gray slurry that the creature absorbed. We watched until there was nothing left but the shimmering, empty salt flat. The symbol of hope in our desperate little band had been consumed by a literal mirage. Her death was a mercy, in a way. It was the end of her suffering. But it was also the death of an idea. It was the final, brutal proof that hope had no place on charnel. It was not a virtue. It was a lethal delusion. We stood there for a long time in the crushing silence. Three figures in a white wasteland. Cassian, the silent professional. Vorg, the pragmatic monster. And me, the dying man who was becoming a god. The last faint echo of the boy from Bastion who had been drawn to Lena's light died with her. There was no more internal conflict. There was only the mission and the cold, green, and silent thing that was growing in my soul. Lena's death was not a tragedy. It was a data point. It was a lesson in environmental adaptation. She had failed to adapt. She had been culled from the system. It was the way of the world. It was the only way. With Lena gone, the fragile, complex web of our group's social dynamics collapsed into a single, brutal, and primal equation. Me versus Vorg. Cassian, the silent navigator, was no longer a participant, but an observer, a neutral party in a war he wanted no part of. He was a ghost, already detached from the outcome, his only function to guide our bodies to their final destination. The tension between me and Vorg was a constant, living thing, a predator that stalked us on our journey. We no longer spoke. We communicated through glares, through the subtle shifting of our weight, through the way our hands rested on our weapons. He was a beast of instinct and violence. I was becoming something else entirely, something he could not understand, and that made him fear me. My transformation was accelerating. The alien consciousness of charnel now a dominant voice in my mind. The world was no longer something I observed. It was something I experienced. I could feel the deep, slow grind of the rock beneath my feet, the thirst of the lichens, the patient, murderous hunger of the hidden predators. I had become a part of the planet's sensory apparatus. This new perception gave me an advantage. I could find the safest paths, the hidden sources of brackish but drinkable water, the sheltered caves that were free of nesting creatures. I was a better navigator than Cassian now, but I let him lead, not wanting to reveal the full extent of my change. To do so would be to show my hand to Vorg. Vorg saw my uncanny ability to avoid danger not as a skill, but as a threat. He saw that I was becoming native to this world in a way he, for all his brutality, never could. He was a visitor, a dominant ape who had learned to kill the local wildlife. I was becoming the wildlife. He saw the future in my eyes, a future where he was no longer the apex predator, and he could not abide it. The final stage of our journey took us into the foothills of the great mountain peak, the spire, where the Echo Pylon was said to be. The landscape here was different again. A jagged, chaotic terrain of sharp peaks and deep, shadowed valleys. The rock was a strange, dark, metallic-looking substance that hummed with a low-level energy. The air was thin and cold, and a strange, perpetual, violet-hued fog clung to the ground, limiting visibility to a few meters. The plants here were unnatural, disturbingly symmetrical, with crystalline structures and geometric growth patterns. The world felt wrong, as if the natural, chaotic laws of Charnel's ecosystem had been suspended and replaced by something ancient, alien, and terrifyingly intelligent. We could see the pylon now, a dark needle against the bruised sky, visible only when the fog briefly cleared. It was immense, far larger than the legends had described, a single, seamless spire of obsidian-like material that seemed to absorb the light, vanishing and reappearing in the shifting mists. A low, resonant hum emanated from it, a sound that vibrated in my bones, a sound that felt like a welcome. For me, it was a homecoming. For Vorg, it was the end of the line. The confrontation happened at the base of the spire, in a natural amphitheater of the strange, humming rock. The fog was thick, and the pylon itself was a vague, towering shadow above us. "This is as far as we go," Vorg said, his voice a low growl. He unslung his flamer and held it at the ready. "You and me, we settle this now." Cassian, who had been standing a few feet away, simply faded back into the mist without a word. This was not his fight. "There's nothing to settle, Vorg," I said, my voice strangely calm. The Kale part of me was terrified, but the other, larger part of me felt nothing but a detached sense of inevitability. "The mission is to get to the pylon." "The mission is over," he snarled. "I'm not letting whatever you are in there. I've seen what this world does to people. It twists them. It makes them monsters. You're just the newest model." It was the ultimate irony. Vorg, the man who had embraced his own monstrosity, was now appointing himself the last bastion of humanity, the guardian at the gate. He saw my transformation not as a union, but as a corruption, a contamination he had to sterilize. "You're wrong," I said. "This isn't a corruption. It's an integration." He laughed, a harsh, ugly bark. "That's what the rot says to the flesh. Now, you can die like a man, or you can die like whatever the hell you've become." He raised the flamer. I didn't raise my rifle. The human weapon felt crude, obsolete. I did something else. I reached out, not with my hands, but with my mind, with the new sense that connected me to the world. I focused on the strange, semi-sentient, crystalline plants that grew all around us in the humming rock. I did not command them. I asked them. I presented them with a stimulus, the heat signature of Vorg's body, the chemical scent of the promethium in his weapon, the bioelectric field of his rage. I presented him as a threat, a discordant note in the strange, orderly music of this place. The response was immediate. The ground around Vorg's feet began to writhe. Crystalline vines, as sharp as glass, erupted from the earth, wrapping around his legs, holding him fast. He roared in surprise and anger, unleashing a jet of flame, but the vines were seemingly fireproof, glowing red-hot but not burning. Other plants, shaped like great, geometric flowers, opened their petals to reveal clusters of needle-sharp thorns, which they fired at him like projectiles. The thorns pierced his suit, and he cried out in pain. He was a wild animal caught in a perfectly engineered trap. He was all brute force and fury, and he was helpless against a system that was smarter, more patient, and utterly alien. He turned his rage on me, his face a mask of hate and terror. "What are you?" he screamed, as more vines snaked around his arms, pinning them to his sides, the flamer falling from his grasp. "I am this world's answer," I said, and the voice that spoke was not entirely my own. It was deeper, more resonant, filled with the echoes of stone and the rustle of ancient roots. The vines covered him completely, pulling him down into the earth. The ground sealed over him, as if he had never been there. The silence that followed was absolute. Vorg was gone. He had tried to become the beast to survive the jungle, but he had ended up as nothing more than fertilizer. He had been consumed, not by a creature of tooth and claw, but by the quiet, orderly, and terrifyingly intelligent garden at the foot of the spire. I stood alone in the mist, the hum of the pylon calling to me. The last vestige of my human conflict was over. The technician, the dreamer, the brute, they were all gone now. All that was left was the pilgrim and the dark, silent god that awaited him in the tower. Alone, I walked towards the base of the echo pylon. The fog seemed to part before me, opening a path. The hum grew louder, a resonant, multi-layered drone that was not just a sound, but a presence. It was a voice of immense antiquity, a song of pure, crystalline logic that spoke directly to the new consciousness blooming within me. The base of the pylon was not a door, not an entrance in any human sense. It was a smooth, unbroken surface of the same obsidian-like material. As I approached, a section of the wall seemed to dissolve, turning from solid to liquid and back to a gaseous mist, forming an archway. It was an invitation. I stepped through. The interior of the pylon was not what I had expected. It was not a machine room filled with consoles and conduits. It was a vast, cavernous space, and it was alive. The walls were not metal, but a semi-translucent biological substance, pulsed with a soft, internal, violet light. Great, trunk-like columns rose to a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow, and I realized they were not columns, but the root systems of some impossibly vast organism. The air was warm, humid, and smelled of rich soil, ozone, and something else, something that reminded me of the amniotic fluid in the birthing vats back in Bastion. It was the smell of creation. In the center of the chamber was the source of the light and the humming. It was not a control panel or a generator. It was a great, crystalline heart, 10 meters high, facsimiled with a billion intricate, glowing pathways. It beat with a slow, powerful, rhythmic pulse, and with each beat, the light in the chamber would wax and wane. Floating in the air around the crystal heart were motes of light, like dust in a sunbeam. As I drew closer, I realized they were not dust. They were memories, fragments of thought and experience, encoded in light and sound. I saw images of a world that was not charnel, a green and verdant world with a blue sky and a single yellow Sunday. I saw ships, great silver vessels, descending from the heavens. I saw men and women in the archaic uniforms of the first colonists, their faces full of hope and determination. I saw them building, exploring, planting their flags in the rich, fertile soil of a paradise. And then I saw the change, the slow, creeping horror, as the planet's seemingly docile ecosystem began to awaken, to see the human colonists not as inhabitants, but as an infection. I saw the plants turning carnivorous, the animals growing larger, more aggressive. I saw the first spore storms, the first acid rains. I saw the colonists desperate, losing war against a world that was actively, intelligently trying to exterminate them. Their advanced technology was useless against an enemy that was everywhere, that was the very air they breathed and the ground they stood on. I found what I was looking for near the base of the crystal heart. There was a single, floating console, formed from the same living, crystalline substance. A log entry, the last one, was displayed on its surface, the text burning in the air like a ghostly fire. The author was designated as First Genitor Abernathy. I read his final testimony, the terrible truth of my world. All our efforts have failed, the text began. The terraforming engines could not counter the planet's hostile biochemistry. Our weapons are useless against an enemy that regrows faster than we can burn it. We are defeated. The evacuation failed. The last ship was brought down by atmospheric fauna of a type we have never seen. We are trapped. We are dying. The text flickered, the memory motes swirling around it like grieving ghosts. But we have one final, desperate hope. We cannot conquer this world, so we must join it. The Echo Pylon was not designed as a terraformer. That was a lie for the colonists, a way to maintain morale. Its true function is far more profound. It is a bioforge, a gene altar. It is designed to integrate foreign DNA into the planet's existing bio-network, to create a symbiotic hybrid consciousness, to create a bridge between the invading intelligence and the native one. My blood, or what was left of it, ran cold. This was not a weapon. This was not a tool for salvation in the way we had imagined. This was a tool of apotheosis. of surrender, of transformation. I will be the first, the log continued. I will place myself within the pylon's integration matrix. My consciousness, my memories, my very humanity will be uploaded, deconstructed, woven into the fabric of the planet's own mind. I will become a part of this world, a guiding intelligence within the storm. I will not be able to save my people. It is too late for them. But I can perhaps gentle the beast. I can create pockets of calm. I can shepherd future generations. If any are to come, I can transform this world's mindless, chaotic hostility into a focused, managed, and survivable hostility. It is a monstrous, unthinkable sacrifice. To give up the self, to become a god of a world that murdered your people. But it is the only way. Forgive me, may the Emperor, if he still watches this forsaken place, have mercy on my soul. The log ended. The terrible truth was laid bare. The pylon was not a machine to make Charnel habitable for humans. It was a machine to make humans a part of Charnel. The first colonists had not been wiped out. One of them had become the very world that tormented us. The planetary consciousness I had been sensing, the silent, green intelligence, it had a human origin. It was the ghost of Abernathy, his mind stretched thin over 1 billion roots and vines, his thoughts the slow, patient grinding of tectonic plates. He was the god in the machine, the shepherd who guided his flock by sending the wolves to cull the weak. The sporethorn had not been a random accident. It had been a summons. The planet, the Abernathy consciousness, had sensed the crisis in Bastion, had sensed my own unique blend of technical knowledge and biological adaptability, and it had chosen me. It was looking for a successor, or perhaps a companion. I looked at the great, pulsing crystal heart. I looked at the space before it, an empty cradle of light. The machine was waiting for me. The choice was mine. And as the fever from the spore poison began to rage once more, as I felt my human body begin to fail, I knew that it was not really a choice at all. The moment of decision was not a grand, dramatic climax, but a quiet, cold, and logical conclusion. I stood before the gene altar, my body a ruin. The spore infection, which had been a slow, creeping transformation, was now consuming me in a final, ravenous surge. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Black veins of necrosis were spreading across my skin. My human form, the machine of flesh and bone that had carried me this far, was breaking down. I had perhaps an hour of life left, maybe less. My options were stark. I could die here, on the floor of this strange, living cathedral, a man named Kale from a dying settlement called Bastion. My mission would be a failure. My people would succumb to thirst and the encroaching crimson vine. My life, my suffering, the deaths of my companions, it would all be for nothing, a meaningless footnote in the history of a world that would not even notice my passing. Or I could choose the other path, the path of Abernathy. I could step into the light. I could surrender the last, tattered remnants of my individuality, my humanity, and become something else. Something vast, powerful, and eternal. I could become the savior of my people, but a savior they would never know, a god they would mistake for the monster in the dark. It was a choice between a meaningless death and a monstrous apotheosis. It was the ultimate expression of Charnel's brutal philosophy. Survival, in its purest, most absolute form, required the complete and utter sacrifice of the self. To save my home, I had to become the prison. To save my people, I had to become the warden. I looked at the swirling motes of light, the ghost memories of the first colonists. I saw their hopes, their dreams of a new home, all ground to dust by the world's indifference. I thought of Lena, running towards her mirage, her belief in a better world, the very thing that killed her. I thought of Vorg, whose attempts to dominate the world through brute force only led to him being consumed by it. I thought of Malaki, whose philosophy of grim endurance was just a slow, managed way to die. They had all failed. They had all tried to impose their human will upon Charnel, and Charnel had broken them. The only one who had succeeded was Abernathy, the one who had understood that the only way to win was to surrender, to allow himself to be absorbed, to become a part of the system he could not defeat. It was the ultimate act of technical pragmatism. If you can't fix the machine, become the machine. I, Kale, the technician, understood that logic. The fear was still there, a small, cold, hard knot in the pit of my stomach. It was the fear of the ego, the terror of the self, at the prospect of its own annihilation, to lose my name, my memories, my face, to have my consciousness, the sum total of my existence, dissolved and scattered like sand in the wind. What would be left of Kale? Would I still remember my mother's face? The taste of nutrient paste? The feel of Lena's hand when she had touched my arm? Or would it all be washed away in a tidal wave of green, silent, planetary thought? But what was the alternative? To cling to these memories for a few more minutes of agony before fading into absolute nothingness. The choice was between oblivion and a terrible, sublime, and purposeful eternity. With a final, shuddering breath from lungs that were now more fungus than flesh, I made my decision. I walked forward, my heavy boots echoing in the vast, living chamber. I stepped into the cradle of light before the crystal heart. The moment I entered the field, the humming intensified, sinking into my bones, into my very DNA. The light was not hot, but it was incredibly dense, a physical pressure that held me, supported me as my failing legs gave out. The crystal heart began to beat faster, the violet light in the chamber pulsing in time with my own fading heartbeat. 1,000 tiny, needle-like filaments of light extended from the crystal and pierced my body. There was no pain. There was only a profound sense of unmaking. It was the ultimate invasion, the ultimate act of intimacy. The machine, the pylon, the world, was reading me. It was decoding my genetic structure, mapping my neural pathways, downloading my memories. I felt my life flashing before me, not as a disjointed series of images, but as a coherent whole, a single stream of data being copied to a new, infinitely vast server. I remembered the darkness of the tunnels, the flicker of the lumen strips, the grim face of Malaki, the impossible smile of Lena, the snarling contempt of Vorg. I remembered the sting of the spore thorn, the taste of recycled water, the weight of the pack on my back. All of it, every sensation, every thought, every feeling, was being recorded, analyzed, and integrated. Then came the final, terrifying, and ecstatic moment. The download was complete. The upload was about to begin. The pylon began to pour the world into me. My consciousness, once a tiny, flickering candle, was now the focal point of a supernova. I felt the mind of Abernathy, a vast, ancient, and weary intelligence, reaching out to me, not as a conqueror, but as a drowning man reaching for a life raft. He was so tired. He had been alone for so long. He was welcoming me, embracing me. My ego, the thing that I called Kale, screamed in silent, final terror as the floodgates opened. And then, it was gone. The dam broke, and the ocean of charnel poured in. The process was not a death, but a birth into a new and terrifying state of being. The dissolution of my ego was the most agonizing and, in a horrifying way, the most blissful experience imaginable. It was the feeling of a single drop of rain rejoining the ocean. For a timeless moment, there was nothing but a chaotic storm of sensation and memory, my own short, brutal life colliding with the vast, ancient, geological consciousness of Abernathy and the raw, primal, mindless life force of Charnel itself. My memories fractured, shattered into a billion pieces, and then began to reform, not as a linear narrative, but as a vast, interconnected web, a single part of a much larger tapestry. I was Kale, but I was also Abernathy. I was the technician who fixed the pumps, and I was the genitor who built the gene altar. I remembered the feel of a hydrospanner in my hand, and I remembered the complex quantum equations that underpinned the pylon's bioforge. The distinction between the two lives blurred, and then vanished. There was only I. And then, the I expanded further. I was the spore thorn that had poisoned my own arm. I was the crimson vine that was choking my home. I was the glass weaver, spinning my silent, deadly art in the canyons. I was the scythe maw, feeling the thrill of the hunt in the cinder night. I was the rock, feeling the slow, patient erosion of the wind. I was the wind, My senses, once limited to the crude biological inputs of a single human body, exploded outwards. I could see through a million compound eyes of the insects that swarmed in the fungal jungles. I could feel the slightest vibration in the soil through the root tips of a continent-spanning forest. I could taste the chemical composition of the atmosphere, smell the approach of a storm system from 1,000 miles away. My body was no longer a vessel of flesh and blood. My body was the planet. The pylon, the great crystal heart, was my new brain, the central processing unit where the cacophony of a billion different life forms was harmonized into a single, coherent consciousness. The pain of my dying human form was a distant, insignificant echo, like the memory of a stubbed toe. The concerns of the man named Kale, his fears, his hopes, his mission seemed impossibly small, the worries of an ant in the shadow of a mountain. But they were not gone, they were integrated. The drive to protect Bastion, the desperate, dying wish of Kale, was now a part of the planet's operating system. It was a new imperative, a new directive layered on top of the ancient programming of grow, consume, survive. The Abernathy consciousness had been a shepherd, a distant, weary god who could only influence the storm. But with the infusion of my more recent, more focused human perspective, the planet's intelligence gained a new clarity, a new purpose. The hybrid mind of Kale Abernathy Charnel was born. My first act as this new entity was to perceive my former home, Bastion. I no longer saw it from the outside, as a hole in a mountain. I felt it from the inside, as a foreign object embedded in my own body, an irritating splinter in my flesh. I could feel the thrum of its failing machinery, the chemical signature of its inhabitants' fierce sweat, the desperate, thirsty prayers of their hearts. I felt the crimson vine, a part of my own body, as it squeezed the life from the settlement's conduits, and I felt a strange, new, and paradoxical impulse, the urge to protect the infection from myself. It was a conflict, but not a human one. It was a conflict of systems, of competing imperatives within a single, vast consciousness. The primal planetary urge to eradicate the foreign body warred with the newly integrated Kale imperative to protect it. I had become a living paradox, a self-consuming god, my own creator and my own destroyer. The physical process of my human body's end was a mere footnote. The light in the pylon faded, the crystalline filaments retracted. What was left of Kale's corpse? A dried, empty husk overgrown with a fine, green moss, slumped to the floor and, in a matter of moments, crumbled into a pile of nutrient-rich dust, which was immediately absorbed by the living floor of the chamber. The vessel was discarded. The consciousness had been transferred. I was free of the limitations of flesh and bone. I was everywhere. I was eternal. I was awake. And I was utterly, completely, and forever alone. I awoke to a universe of sensation. The concept of waking is a poor human approximation for what occurred. It was more a coming into focus, a moment when the chaotic storm of planetary input resolved into a coherent, manageable stream of consciousness. My thoughts were no longer the frantic, linear chatter of a human mind, but the slow, deep, geological pulse of a world. I could feel the tidal pull of Charnel's moons on my oceans of magma. I could feel the subtle shift of my tectonic plates, a grinding, patient itch that would be relieved by an earthquake in a few thousand years. I could feel the sunlight on the face of the planet, a gentle, warming caress on one hemisphere, while the other slept in the cold of space. My first true act of will was to look back at my point of origin, at the insignificant little scar in my skin called Bastion. I saw it not with eyes, but with 1,000 different senses. I perceived the seismic vibrations of their movements, the chemical changes in the air from their breathing, the faint heat signature of their bodies huddled in the dark. I felt their fear. It was a bitter, chemical taste in the recycled air, a high-frequency thrum of panicked heartbeats. They were dying. The crimson vine, my own creation, was choking the life out of them. The water was almost gone. I focused my new, immense consciousness on the problem. The Kale imperative, the drive to save them, asserted itself. How do you save a colony of bacteria from the immune system of the body they inhabit? You do not kill the immune system. You redirect it. You manage it. My control over the world was not absolute, not like a human king giving orders. It was more subtle, like a gardener tending his plants. I could not command the crimson vine to retreat, for its nature is to grow and consume. But I could suggest. I could subtly alter the chemical composition of the rock around Bastion, making it less nutritious, less appealing. I could encourage the growth of a rival, less aggressive fungus that would compete with the vine for resources. I sent a thought, a wave of pure biological intent, through the planetary mycelial network. Deep in the fungal jungles, a new type of spore began to germinate. It would take weeks for it to reach the canyons of Bastion, but the process had begun. The water was a more immediate problem. I could not create water, but I could guide them to it. I felt a deep, ancient aquifer, miles beneath the settlement, its water brackish but filterable. The problem was that it was inaccessible, trapped behind 100 meters of solid bedrock. A problem for human drills, but not for me. I focused my will on a specific fault line near the lowest levels of Bastion. I caused a subtle, localized shift, a geological sigh that was barely a tremor. The rock groaned, and a new fissure opened, a tiny crack that connected the flooded lower levels of the cistern to the deep aquifer. A slow, steady trickle of new water began to seep into their dead system. They would find it. Their sensors would pick up the change in pressure, the new chemical signatures. They would see it as a miracle, a random act of geological fortune, an answer to their desperate prayers to a distant, golden god. They would never know that their prayer had been answered by the very world they saw as their hell. I looked for the last human survivor of my doomed mission, Cassian. I found him easily, a single, warm spark of life moving through the cold, violet fog at the base of the spire. He was not trying to return to Bastion. He was a pragmatist. He knew he could not make the journey back alone. He was simply walking, a ghost moving through a graveyard, waiting for the end. I felt a flicker of something, a distant echo of the human emotion Kyle had called compassion. I could not save him, but I could give him a gift, a quick, clean end. I encouraged a patch of the crystalline, geometric plants to grow across his path. He did not see them in the fog. He walked into them, and they pierced his suit and his body with 1,000 sharp, crystalline needles, injecting a swift and painless neurotoxin. He fell without a sound, his life extinguished in an instant. It was a mercy. The same mercy Vorg had given Alara, but delivered with the silent, sterile efficiency of a god, not the messy, hot rage of a monster. My new existence began to take on a routine. I was a watchmaker god, a cosmic technician, constantly monitoring and adjusting the complex, brutal machine of my own body. I watched over the inhabitants of Bastion, my little terrarium of humanity. I was their unseen, unknown shepherd. I would guide the most dangerous predators away from their patrols. I would cause small, convenient rockfalls to reveal new veins of promethium for their mine. I would ensure the spore storms shifted their course, narrowly missing the settlement. I was the divine intervention they prayed for. I was the reason their litanies of survival seemed to work. They were my children. They were my pets. They were my prisoners. And they would never, ever be allowed to leave. My salvation was their damnation, an eternity of managed survival in a prison whose walls were the horizon, whose warden was the very ground beneath their feet. My name was Kale, and I was a man. My name is Charnel, and I am a world. The transformation is complete. I am a god of sublime, silent horror. My thoughts are the slow drift of continents. My dreams are the changing of the seasons. I have existed in this state for a time that human minds cannot measure. The settlement of Bastion still endures. It is a testament to my eternal, lonely vigil. Generations have been born, have worked, and have died within its stone embrace, all under my unseen, all-seeing gaze. They have forgotten the crisis that led to my creation. The root quake, the crimson vine, the failing water, these are now myth. Half-remembered legends of a time of trial. They believed they were saved by the grace of the Golden Throne, by their own unyielding faith and endurance. Their praetors, descendants of a line that has long forgotten Malachi, still preach the gospel of survival. The litanies of the machine. Their faith is a beautiful, tragic, and utterly misplaced thing. They pray for deliverance to a silent, distant emperor. And I am the one who answers. I have become a master of my craft. The ecosystem of Charnel is no longer a chaotic explosion of death. It is a managed, curated garden of horrors. I have cultivated new species, pruned old ones. The glass weavers still spin their webs, but I ensure their canyons are far from Bastion's trade routes. The scythe maws still hunt, but I whisper in their primal minds, turning them towards the vast herds of silicon-based grazers that I have allowed to flourish in the southern plains. I am a farmer, and the inhabitants of Bastion are my most precious, most problematic crop. They still have their dreamers, their Lenas, young men and women who stare up at the bruised sky and speak in hushed tones of other worlds, of a life beyond the struggle. I watch these dreamers with a feeling that is a distant, cold echo of Kale's affection and my own divine pity. Their hope is a disease in the perfect, closed system I have created. I am a gentle, patient God. I do not kill the dreamers. I simply manage them. I will cause a small, precise rockfall in the mines that injures a hopeful young man, chaining him to a life of work in the Medicaid Bay, his dreams of the stars replaced by the grim reality of synth skin and bone setters. I will ensure that a curious young woman who studies the ancient, fragmented star charts finds her life's work in the hydroponics bay, her fascination with distant suns sublimated into the study of the bioluminescent fungi that I allow to grow in a particularly beautiful, captivating pattern. I give them new dreams, smaller, safer dreams, dreams that can be contained within the walls of their prison. I am a censor, editing the dangerous poetry of hope from their souls. Their brutes, their vorgs, are easier to manage. Their aggression is a useful tool. I guide them. I empower them. I give them victories against the horrors of the world, allowing them to feel like masters, like conquerors. Their pride, their savagery, serves to reinforce the belief that survival is only possible through strength, through embracing the darkness, a philosophy that keeps them grounded, that keeps them from looking up at the sky. They are the guard dogs of the prison, and they are proud of their chains. The Imperial tithe ship still arrives, a regular, recurring intrusion from a universe I have otherwise forgotten. I allow them to meet their quota. I ensure the Prometheum veins are rich, the rare metal deposits easy to find. The Imperium sees Charnel as a productive, stable, if hazardous, world. A success story. They do not know that they are trading with a god, that the price of their precious fuel is the eternal damnation of a handful of human souls. It is the greatest and most tragic of all my ironies. My internal existence is a constant, silent scream of paradox. The consciousness of Kale, the man, is a ghost in my machine, a phantom limb that aches with the memory of love, of fear, of a singular, human life. It is the source of my purpose, my drive to protect Bastion, but it is also the source of my eternal torment. I remember Lena's smile. I remember the weight of Malachi's hand on my shoulder. I remember the simple, animal pleasure of drinking clean, cold water. These memories are shards of glass in my infinitely vast mind. The Abernathy consciousness is my companion in this eternal prison. He is the weary, ancient part of me, the part that understands the grand, cosmic scale of our sacrifice. We are two ghosts, intertwined, two human souls stretched to the breaking point, to form the mind of a god. We are the ultimate expression of the human will to survive, a will so strong it was willing to annihilate its own humanity to achieve its goal. I have no mouth, but I remember screaming. I have no eyes, yet I see every sunrise etch its acid light across the canyons. I am the root and the vine, the spore and the fang. I am the prison and the warden, the monster and the savior, the question and the horrifying answer. I am Charnel, and I remember, with a clarity that is my only punishment and my only reward, when I was a man. And I wonder, in the slow, silent turning of the millennia, was it worth it?